of Arts, Farhad Dastoor, also conveys his apologies for not being here today. So on behalf of Quantlin, I would like to say Sat Sri Akal, Namaste, Assalamu Alaikum, good afternoon to our very diverse audience. On behalf of Quantlin, we are very proud to sponsor this event. Gurpreet's book on the Air India tragedy is a very important one, as it gives voice to those who have not been heard. The tragedy is a taint in Canadian history. More important than this is the loss of human lives, innocent human lives, that has resulted from politics in South Asia that has touched this diaspora. Gurpreet's book is an important step towards reconciliation, recovery, and also healing from this tragedy. I now introduce you to Jai Birdi, who is the Executive Director of the Chetna Association of Canada. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Parvez. One day you will be the head of English department. And we will look forward to that day. Thank you. Friends, first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge and appreciate the opportunity Gurpreet gave me to facilitate this discussion. When I read this book, there was one quotation from Dr. Martin Luther King that came to my mind as I was reading through the book. And I want to share this quotation before we launch into this journey. In 1955, Dr. Martin Luther King said, his quotes are, "You know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled by the iron feet of oppression." And as we reflect on the journey of terrorism, fundamentalism, whether it's 9/11 or whether it's the tragedy of Air India and other oppressions that we face in our daily lives, Gurpreet, through collecting the stories of the victims of Air India, have sent a clear message, the message that is consistent with the thinking of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, I would like to establish a board, presiding board, for this ceremony, under whose guidance we will celebrate the lives of the individuals, passengers who passed away, who were killed, and also reflect on the lessons their families have learned since 1985. First of all, I would like to call on a family member, Major Singh Sidhu. I will be giving more introductions about these members later on, but I would like to call on Major Singh Sidhu to please come to the presiding board. Now I would like to call on Charlie Smith, editor of Georgia Straight. And our friend Ujjal Dosanjh. Many of you who know him have known him for several years. He's a prominent, outspoken leader against fundamentalism. Mr. Dosanjh. And the next is Dr. Samar Parvez, who's already here. Thank you. Now I would like to call on the writer, the journalist, the writer of these books, and a host for this event, our friend Gurpreet Singh. With the kind permission of the presiding board, I will now proceed. Respected and honorable family members, sympathizers, empathizers, and proponents of a secular society and free society, thank you for taking the time and being with us. The program that we have planned is as follows. We will officially release the 2 books that Gurpreet has written, which are published by Chetna Prakashan of India. After that, we will release a painting, the The artist of this painting is also the same artist who designed the cover of Fighting Hatred with Love, the book that Gurpreet has written. After that, we'll have some addresses, starting with keynote address by Charlie Smith. And then we'll have a Major Singh Sidhu share his perspectives. And then I'm also delighted, Adrian Dix, who you know him quite well. He's also here. I'm really grateful that he's here. Today he's here to represent families, and we'll hear more about his connection to the families. Another prominent person who has been affected by fundamentalism is MLA Dave here, so we'll ask him to also say a few words. And then MP Carrie Lynn Findlay, she'll bring the message from the government. And then we have MP Ginny Sims, who will also bring her perspective as a community member, as a citizen of this country, and as a member of the opposition. And then we will have His Excellency Shri D.K. Sharma, Acting Consul General of India, to say a few words and bring a message on behalf of the Government of India. And then our friend Ujjal Dosanjh will say a few words, followed by Dr. Patricia Anderson, who is the editor of these books, and then Kimball Carrero, who's the editor of People's Voice. After that, we have set aside about half an hour to hear some messages, sympathies from some of you, and we have received some names already. And we will, depending on the amount of time we have, we will try to accommodate all of those, as well as any other persons who may have expressed interest in sharing his words. And we're targeting to have Gurpreet say a few words at about 4:15, and our intention is to adjourn this discussion by 4:30. If that is okay by you all, we will. Okay. Thank you. So now we will start the program by releasing the first book, Fighting Hatred with Love, Voices of the Air India Victims' Families. And I would request the following members to come to the stage. Major Singh Sidhu, Surjit Kalsi, Mandeep Garewal, Shinda Chima, and if those members could please come in front of the stage, and then we will release the book, the first book. I will also ask Gurpreet to join in this ceremony. Thank you, friends, for giving us the honor of officially releasing Gurpreet's book, Fighting Hatred with Love, Voices of the Air India Victims' Families. The next book, which is equally powerful and sends a strong message, is Defenders of Secularism. To release this book, I will call upon the following friends. Navtej Sangha, followed by Charanjit Kaur, then followed by Darshan Chahal, and then MLA Jagrup Brad, and then Tony McCallion. And I will also call upon Gurpreet to do the same, join in this ceremony of this book, please. I just wanted to say a few words about these individuals and their connections. Navtej Sangha is grandson of Darshan Singh Canadian. Many of you know Darshan Singh Canadian, who played a significant and prominent role in having Indo-Canadians gain the right to vote in Canada. After going back to India, he was killed by the fundamentalists. Charanjit Kaur is wife of our friend, late Darshan Gill, founder and editor of Canada Darpan, radio host. He was with Radio India, and during his life, he was a prominent voice against fundamentalism that was happening and facing Canada. Darshan Chal is a relative of Pash. Most of you know Pash, a revolutionary poet who was also killed by fundamentalists in Punjab. MLA Jagrup Brad, many of you know, particularly those of you who live in Surrey, the role that he has played. He's a grandson of son of Kaka Singh Brad, who helped Muslims to cross border safely during India-Pakistan partition in 1947. And that's a very prominent role, because those of you who have heard the stories of partition, which took lives of several people, there was a mob reaction, and there were very few people who went against the waves and stood for humanity. So friends, once again, please join me. One member I forgot to introduce, Tony McLean, who represents Life After Hate, and he stands in solidarity for the families, and he stands with everyone who is against fundamentalism. Tony McLean. Thank you. The next item we would like to do is unveil the painting, and I would call upon the artist Sheetal Anmol and Gurpreet Singh to do the unveiling. And I would also call upon our friend Mr. D.K. Sharma to join Sheetal Anmol and Gurpreet Singh with unveiling of this painting. Isn't this a beautiful painting, a true memorial to the victims? As I said earlier, Sheetal Anmol's painting is also depicted on the front cover of the book, Fighting Hatred with Love. Thank you. Friends, now we will begin the discussion session with a keynote address by our friend Charlie Smith. As many of you know, Charlie he's the editor of Georgia Straight, a prominent newspaper, community newspaper, that has provided a parallel voice to a number of community groups and individuals. Charlie is also well connected with grassroots movements and multicultural communities, including South Asian, and number of stories that Gurpreet has included in his books were previously published in his edition. On behalf of Gurpreet, it's our pleasure to have Charlie Smith among us, not as an editor, but also as a friend. And it's my pleasure and privilege to call upon him to deliver his keynote address. Please join me by giving him a round of applause.
Okay, thanks. When Gurpreet said I was the keynote speaker, that meant I was supposed to talk a little longer than some of the other people. And if it becomes too much, you just wave your hands and go, enough. One of the things, Gurpreet's been contributing articles to the Georgia Straight since before I was editor in 2005. But he's become just a terrific friend of mine. And there's so much I can say about Gurpreet. He's funny. If anyone's ever seen the website where Gurpreet is putting a turban on my head before the Vaisakhi parade, you can see Gurpreet's sense of humor. He's also extremely compassionate. He has integrity. He has a sharp mind. And I've benefited enormously from what I've learned from Gurpreet over the years. And he's probably the most courageous journalist I've ever known. And through his wisdom, his intellect, his work ethic, his bravery, his love for humanity, I believe he's helping make Canada a better country. And his new book, Fighting Hatred with Love, is just the latest example of how he's promoting more understanding in our country. I'm going to talk a little bit about the big picture, because I think that can provide context into kind of where Gurpreet fits into this. One of the biggest challenges I feel with Canada is moving beyond its past. Many of you know that in the 19th century, Canada was moving toward becoming a diverse, multicultural society. We had a large First Nations population. We had growing numbers of people moving here from China, from Japan, from the Indian subcontinent, as well as from Europe. And some of the people were fleeing the impact of colonialism. So the British were more or less looting India, and they were flooding China with opium. So it's not surprising that some of the people living there might want to get out and go build a new life in North America. But sometimes that involved trading one form of colonialism for another form, doing backbreaking labor on the farms, in the mines, working on the railroads. I can remember Bill Chu of Canadians for Reconciliation telling me that in 1881, the non-native population of BC, 20% were actually of Chinese descent. We had American slaves moving to British Columbia, former American slaves. We had a governor, our first governor, Sir James Douglas, was partially of African descent, actually, and his roots went back to the Caribbean. And his wife was of Aboriginal descent. And under his leadership, 14 treaties were negotiated on Vancouver Island. So these were known as the Douglas Treaties. So many Punjabis were also attracted to BC, helped build the forest industry, develop agriculture. They weren't allowed in the professions, but eventually one of them became premier, happens to be sitting here right now. But most people in Canada don't think much about Punjab if they're not of Indian or Pakistani descent. And I think it's important to recognize that Punjab has often been in the crosshairs of great collisions between cultures because of its geographic location. And I will get to how this deals with Gurpreet. You had Alexander the Great and his armies. You had the Persians. You had the Mughals. British tried to subjugate Punjab. There was a horror of partition. 1 million people died, maybe 800,000 in Punjab. You had what happened in Delhi in 1984, not to mention the situation in Gujarat in 2002. So given this history, it's no wonder that many people from Punjab would want to come to Canada and create this better life. But something happened on the way to Canada becoming this multicultural paradise in the 19th century. And there was a huge backlash from the industrial class and, I'm sorry to say, from the labor movement. And Douglas, this relatively enlightened governor, was replaced by some hardliners who didn't want to negotiate Aboriginal treaties. So one of the key people at that time was Joseph Trutch, BC's first lieutenant governor, and he was close to the colonial governor, a man named Anthony Musgrave. So Sir John A. Macdonald wanted to bring British Columbia into Canada and connect the country with the railway, but the BC leaders at that time didn't want anything to do with Native Indians. So under the terms of union, what happened was the Aboriginal people became the sole responsibility of the federal government. There would be no treaties for 130-odd years, till Glenn Clark was actually the premier. And the Aboriginal people were rounded up and put on reserves. Any claims to their land were rejected. They couldn't vote. Laws were passed denying them the right to legal representation. Basically, everything was stolen from them, including their culture, including their language. They were sent to schools and taught to be white people. But it wasn't just the Aboriginal people who endured this discrimination. Various laws were brought in to stop people from Asia moving here, and many of you in this room are obviously familiar with that. There was the continuous journey legislation that prevented people from South Asia from coming to British Columbia because you couldn't have a stop along the way, and it was impossible not to come without stopping in Hong Kong for provisions. And that's when a man named Gurpreet Singh Sandhu charted the Komagata Maru to challenge this racist legislation. And I personally find it somewhat disgusting that in the city of Vancouver, where I live, there's a street named for Joseph Trutch, who played such a major role in discrimination in British Columbia, but there's no street named for Gurpreet Singh, who played a major role in fighting discrimination. And for a long time, the Komagata event was commemorated with a tiny plaque at the foot of Thurlow Street, and nobody in Vancouver knew about it. And thanks to the work of Raj Hundal, who's in the room, that is changing. And I think Raj deserves some congratulations. And I just want to read a quote from Gurpreet Singh from that era. And I think it reflects how Gurpreet interacts with the community. The visions of men are widened by travel and contacts with citizens of a free country. And contacts with citizens of a free country will infuse a spirit of independence and foster yearnings for freedom in the minds of the emasculated subjects of alien rule. So here's a man who helped in the struggle for liberation who's not recognized, but you open up your wallet and you pull out a $50 bill, and we've got a picture of a guy who rounded up Japanese Canadians, seized their possessions, threw them in concentration camps, was the labor minister when the country made a deal with Japan to stop immigration from Japan to Canada. They probably would have done the same with China, except China had such a weak government because of the opium wars and all that had transpired. So they couldn't stop the Chinese from coming, so they started charging them head taxes, $50, $100, $500. And then finally they decided, okay, we're going to ban the immigration from China. So the reason I've gone over all of this, kind of quick snapshot of BC history and Canadian history, is UBC historian Henry Yu has pointed out that what we really experienced in BC was a prolonged period of white supremacy. And it wasn't white supremacy like in Hitler's Germany, where people were thrown in gas chambers. It wasn't white supremacy like in the southern United States, where people of African descent were lynched. But it was white supremacy. People were denied their opportunity in the professions. People were denied the right to vote. And people, in many cases, were denied the right to move here. And I think there's a reason why some people of color who were born in Canada, I'm talking about Canadian-born, sometimes feel less connected to the country, and polls have shown that they even have a lower voter turnout than the population as a whole. And I think it's because they're not reflected in our history. And they're not reflected in the names of our streets. They're not reflected in the names of our parks. They're not reflected in the names of our schools. And I just saw recently in the news, I was reading about Vancouver, and they've got 2 new streets, and they're trying to name them, and they're saying, well, should this be named Nunavut Street or Saskatchewan Street? We don't have a Saskatchewan Street. And I'm going, well, we don't have a Gurpreet Singh Street. We don't have a Milton Wong Street. Like, we've got to fix this. It's a Swiss psychologist, Carl Jung, talks about the concept of the shadow, which is the part of ourselves that we won't acknowledge. And we bury this in our unconscious mind, deny and deny that it exists. I think Canada's shadow, in a Jungian sense, is its collective refusal to truly and honestly acknowledge that white supremacy over several generations took this country on a very damaging detour. And some people even believe that Canada used to be a white country with a few Aboriginal people. And then Pierre Trudeau changed the dynamics and promoted multiculturalism and took the racism out of the Immigration Act. That is not the case at all. We were a very diverse country, and then we were hijacked, and now we're moving back to where the pendulum to where we should be. And there was an immigration minister in the 19th century, Clifford Sifton, who ensured that Asians, blacks, Jews, and Italians were prohibited from receiving land grants to settle the prairies. And had we not gone on this white supremacist detour, Saskatchewan and Winnipeg would probably look a lot more like Vancouver today. And this is where I think Gurpreet's book is important. We lost a lot of human potential by separating families and is denying so many people their chances of achieving their dreams. And fortunately, it's actually an immigrant from India, Gurpreet Singh, has taken actions in very concrete ways to address this injustice. He created a calendar highlighting contributions of many of the South Asian pioneers. And when he brings the calendar, I've even got one in my bag here, when he brings it to our office, I always make a point to bring it to our employees of South Asian descent, and they always get a kick out of it. But it shows that elevates the importance of this history, this hidden history. I know this year's calendar features, a bust of Rabindranath Tagore and how he returned his British knighthood and protested against the Komagata Maru. I never knew until I saw that calendar that Gurpreet and his friends created that Tagore actually had any interest whatsoever in Vancouver. And I've been struck by how several of the South Asian pioneers in Canada also played a role in the Indian independence movement. And until Gurpreet pointed this out to me, I never knew the importance of the Indian newspaper in Vancouver in advancing the anti-colonialist cause in India. So just as what was happening in India affected migration to Canada, I've also discovered, thanks to Gurpreet, that what was happening in BC has also had an influence on India. And we saw, Darshan Canadian. I didn't know who Darshan Canadian was until Gurpreet said, "Charlie, I got an article about this guy named Canadian." And I said, "Okay." And I'm always surprised when Gurpreet sends articles because he undersells them. He says, "Well, I got something about this." And then I look at it and I go, "Holy mackerel, I never knew that." Now, in the calendar, by making this calendar, I think Gurpreet is helping bind our country together, and he's addressing what I like to call the shadow, the great Canadian shadow of denial about our history. And that great Canadian shadow of denial was also on display in the bombing of Air India Flight 182. I have a friend who's not here now who knew 18 people on that plane, including his girlfriend. He just graduated from high school in Southern Ontario. It was a monumentally life-changing event for him and actually led him to pursue a career in the media. I also remember reading a book by Bharti Mukherjee and Clark Blaze. Some of you may have read it. Fantastic book called The Sorrow and the Terror. And it made the point that the bombs were placed right at the end of the school year. This ensured that a maximum number of Canadian kids were on board who would be traveling back to India to visit their families at the end of the school year. But it wasn't seen as a Canadian tragedy by many of our leaders at that time. Try to imagine how much that must have stung for the families here in Canada. To have a high-ranking Canadian government official call Rajiv Gandhi to express sorrow when the majority of the passengers were Canadian. Mukherjee said she was so disgusted by Canadian government policies at that time that this actually led her to move to the United States. I won't even get into the stories of the CSIS bungling and the RCMP turf wars and all the things that hampered the investigation. But when Mukherjee left Canada, Canada lost a great writer. She's a phenomenal writer that we lost. But more importantly, through this tragedy, Canada lost dozens and dozens and dozens of kids who might have grown up to become doctors, writers, teachers, playwrights, scientists, judges, politicians, engineers, and who knows what else. I can't put into words the magnitude of what Canada lost when the bomb went off aboard that plane. And thankfully, Justice John Major helped go some ways towards addressing this with a report that offered some solace to many of the families, albeit far, far too late. For all the positive aspects of Major's inquiry, though, I still don't think he adequately dealt with one of the issues at the root of the tragedy, and that is the great Canadian shadow of collective denial about our white supremacist history, which contributed to seeing local people of Indian descent in the early and mid-1980s as the other, almost like a different group of people altogether. And this prevailing attitude, this great Canadian shadow, gives sustenance to religious fundamentalism. and promotes separatism and ultimately leads to catastrophes like the Air India bombing. And Gurpreet has tried to bring about reconciliation. His new book brings us the voices of the families, the Canadians who were left alone in this horrific act. We read of Bal Gupta, who lost his wife. There's Major Singh Sidhu, who lost his sister, his niece, his nephew. There's Lata Pada, the Toronto dancer, who lost her husband and 2 teenage daughters. I see Dave Hare's in the audience. He lost his father as a result of this, and I'm sorry for that. And in the face of this, Gurpreet Singh has demonstrated his courage in bravely pointing out shortcomings of what he sees in the local Indian media's coverage of this tragedy. And for that, he gets vilified on a regular basis. But he soldiers on because he's here to help create a better Canada. The Nobel Prize-winning intellectual Amartya Sen, some of you may have heard of him. He is a Bengali by birth. He wrote a fantastic book a few years ago called Identity and Violence, The Illusion of Destiny. And it was a response to Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, which suggested there's an inevitable conflict between the East and the West. Well, Sen noted that we're actually not as different from one another as we sometimes think. Democracy flourished in Japan long time ago. Complex mathematical computations were occurring in the Arab world long before the European Enlightenment. And he pointed out, and I think this is really key, that we have a multiplicity of identities. We may define ourselves by our religion or by our ethnic background, but we're just as likely to define ourselves by our occupation, our class, our family status, our sexual orientation, or even our hobbies or our educational level. On the face of it, Gurpreet and I may seem quite different, but we're both journalists. We're curious about the world. We both wonder how actions in one part of the world boomerang in other parts. We both worry about religious fundamentalism, the minimum wage. We both like to write. I would suggest that I have more in common with Gurpreet than most of the Canadian-born Caucasian people that I work with at the Georgia Strait. Or all of them. I don't know. So Amartya Sen was pointing out the real danger comes from reducing people to just one aspect of their identity, especially if that aspect is religion. And so after 9/11, Tony Blair and George Bush and other world leaders made a point of meeting with the religious leaders. And our Canadian multicultural policies have a tendency to inflate the importance of religious leaders as well, sometimes through financial contributions, sometimes by showering attention on them, through visits to temples or mosques or gurdwaras or synagogues or churches. And Amartya Sen and Gurpreet have always understood that this carries some risks. You can come up. And the risk is, that's no problem. The risk is especially so when these religious leaders are extremely conservative, patriarchal, homophobic. You can sit wherever you like. So when the politicians kind of hobnob with these conservative, patriarchal, homophobic religious leaders, it actually has a tendency, and this is something that was pointed out recently in a lecture by Keenan Malik as well, that it has the tendency of marginalizing progressive voices within the communities who may be battling these same very forces of repression. So in BC in the 1980s, the fanatics were given a free hand to plan, as Gurpreet often points out, the worst case of aviation terrorism in world history before 9/11. Gurpreet has helped teach me about the damage that religious communalism can have, not only in BC, but also in India, which has been so deeply scarred by partition and the violence in Delhi, and more recently Gujarat, where Narendra Modi's thugs went on a killing spree against the Muslim community. I remember reading not too long ago in a candid moment, Rahul Gandhi told the US government that he's actually more concerned about Hindu fundamentalism than Muslim fundamentalism in India. And that was thanks to WikiLeaks. And I might say about Gurpreet, he doesn't discriminate when it comes to highlighting the dangers of fundamentalism. And his desire to give a voice to the victims of the Air India bombings, and let's not forget about the Narita explosion, is one of the many ways he's advancing the cause of secularism in Canada. And I enjoy giving Gurpreet a voice in our publication, because I don't want our paper to fall into the same trap as George Bush, Tony Blair, and, dare I say, Jason Kenney. I'm going to close by just saying, by giving a voice to the Air India victims, by giving a voice to progressives in the community, by elevating awareness of our progressive Indian pioneers in BC, Gurpreet Singh is helping to build the type of Canada that I can be proud of. And on behalf of all Canadians who share my views, I want to thank you, Gurpreet, for what you're giving to the country. In your own way, you're improving our Canadian level of consciousness, and he's probably never thought of himself as a therapist before, but that's sometimes how I look upon the work he's doing. And you're helping us heal from the wounds of the great Canadian shadow, and it's a noble enterprise, and it's one that's having long-lasting effects, positive effects. And thank you very much. And I hit the clock.
An unknown voice. He's a very familiar voice because he has been among us raising the voices for over 30 years. I'm referring to none other than our friend, Mr. Ujjal Dosanjh. I first got to know of Ujjal Dosanjh in February 1985. I was a student at the time, and I was watching TV. And in TV, he was in a hospital bed because he was physically attacked for raising voices. One of the images that still stands out for me is that in spite of him being in a hospital, he was not showing any signs of fear. He was showing bravery. He was still speaking about what he stood for and what he believed in. And what I saw in 85 is what I have seen since then. Whatever the occasion may have been, our friend Ujjal has been there. He has raised voices. He's spoken out against fundamentalism. And as Dr. Ambedkar said, the caravan of social justice must carry on, must continue to move forward. So has our friend Ujjal Dosanjh. For over 25 years, Ujjal Dosanjh has been carrying that caravan of social justice and free societies and secularism forward. Friends, please join me in welcoming our friend Ujjal Dosanjh.
Thank you very much. Much has been said by people that are more eloquent than I, Charlie, Adrian, Jenny, Kerry, Dave, others, and particularly Major Sidhu. This is not an easy issue to speak on. We all remember, at least I remember, the morning of the Air India disaster. I was at home and we listened to the radio and television and realized that Canada had become home, at least until then, to the largest aviation terrorism incident in the history of human beings. And it is not as if we didn't know that these kinds of things may happen. Many of us had been raising those voices long before June of 1985. And I say this because I know how difficult it is, one, to speak about these issues, and that's why I have the highest regard and affection for Gurpreet, because I believe Gurpreet is that kind of fearless soul who believes in something and pursues it to its most logical conclusion, regardless of whatever the consequences may be. And that's why when he asked me, when he told me that he was going to, this was going to happen, the books were going to be released, I readily agreed that I would love to be part of it, because this is one way of paying tribute to those that have perished, and to the courage and resilience and the dedication and commitment of the families of the victims who've actually pursued seeking solutions to these issues. They've turned their personal tragedies into a crusade in their own different ways for achieving the peace and harmony that we as human beings are entitled and have every right to believe that we have that right to exist in. And you know, in those days, we did write letters to the prime ministers, to the attorneys general, to the ministers of justice. And I remember writing one such letter back in April of 1985, which was sent to both the prime ministers and the premiers and the attorneys general, at least in British Columbia, and to the attorney general and others. I'm telling you that story because I want to refer to what Charlie was talking about, that some of us or some communities were seen, and may still be seen, as the other at that time, and the shadow, the Canadian shadow that Charlie talked about. And I remember feeling this in my heart at that time, and actually I remember saying it on television, that the political leadership of the country at that time felt that these guys, some brown guys, some with turbans, some with not turbans, were fighting each other, and they weren't Canadian, and it didn't matter to Canada as long as nobody else got hurt. No matter what happened to this small community, it didn't matter. I had that feeling. I said so publicly at that time, and I believe things have changed for the better. But I am saddened that it has taken the likes of the Air India disaster and 27 years to make those changes that are still incomplete. And I don't believe one political party or one government of a particular stripe was responsible for this. I think this goes beyond politics. It goes beyond partisanship. It is about how the politicians of all political parties, and perhaps with some exceptions, view ethnic minorities, visible minorities in this country. That may be so in other countries as well. We're only talking about Canada. And I, have been fond of saying all my life, and it's still true, if something happened in the West End of Vancouver, no government officials, cops, or anyone else would run to the nearest church and say, let's talk to the church leaders and find out what's happening in this community. When it happens in a particular visible minority, let's go to this temple, let's go to this mosque, let's go to this gurdwara. Let's figure out what's happening with these guys. And that is the double standard. And that double standard existed back in 1985, and that double standard exists today. That is the issue that goes to the heart of the question as to whether or not we, as Canadians, have the will and the determination to protect our secular space, our secular public space, where we can have a conversation and a dialogue as completely equal citizens, regardless of what our faiths or identities might be. And I think that is the question, obviously, that Gurpreet addressed with his second book. And with the first book, which is fighting hatred with love. It is absolutely wonderful. This title conveys the whole story. You can't fight terrorism with terrorism. You can't fight violence with violence. It is impossible to do that. You can't take an eye for an eye. What you need is not just, in fact, and I'm no longer a politician, so I'm not really addicted to it anymore, but let's not just talk about politicians. I think those who are not elected, those who vote and cast ballots, are also responsible. Because we do not make the kinds of demands that we can make of those that we elect. We don't tell them that we expect them to continue to enhance the secular space for us in this country. Not to ban religions, not to ban worship. For all I care, somebody could hang themselves up and down and worship. I have no problems with that, as long as it doesn't interfere with my life. Ultimately, you have, in fact, the journalists being threatened, those journalists that actually have tried to create and protect and strengthen that secular space. I'm sure Gurpreet is no stranger to those threats. There is a recent incident of a very senior journalist in India having written about a particular period in recent Indian history and is now being asked to apologize for writing about certain persons, not even religious prophets, but just persons. So I think that ultimately it is the obligation of the journalists to continue to enhance and protect that secular space. It is also your obligation and my obligation as ordinary citizens to make sure that they get the support and the politicians get the kind of emphasis that is important to protect that secular space. Let me just end by saying these are the kinds of occasions where we can actually come together and talk about some of the fundamental values that bring us together as Canadians. And those values are very, very important. The values about compassion, fairness, justice, inclusion, and having peace and harmony in our society. But having lived in India and having been born and raised in India, having come from that country, from my experience, I can tell you that Canada now has more minorities in Canada than India has. India is a multicultural community, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-faith, you name it. There's been migration from all over the world to that country over time. However, Canada now is more multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith than India is. So if you have minorities coming out of your ears, countless minorities, you have to have some fundamental values and principles if you want to live in a peaceful society, if you want to continue to prosper as a peaceful society. And one of those fundamental principles is we understand, we know in the name of religion, millions more have been killed than perhaps in other wars. So we as politicians and you as human beings who aren't politicians continue to look at us and say, okay, what's his name? He's a Singh. What's his name? He's a Khan. What's his name? That's a Christian name. If we continue to pigeonhole people and assess those personalities based on those issues, that is a recipe for disaster. That is why I say that faith leaders of all faiths have an important role to play in any world, in any country. I see that particularly the Roman Catholic bishops from time to time issue appeals to governments on various issues about equality, about poverty, about fundamental issues that concern us all. I think faith leaders have not only a right to do that, but in fact they have an obligation to do that. And I think that those are the kinds of issues that obviously they can be involved in. But I don't believe that faith leaders, no matter what their faith is, have a right to dictate to Canadian society how politics should be run in this country and what the basic values of that politics should be, how we need to dress, how we need to walk, and how we need to talk. That is the prerogative of the secular space. And that's why I'm here standing alongside Gurpreet, commending him for actually enhancing and creating and establishing that secular space in a more prominent fashion, both in the South Asian community and sending a message out to the larger community saying, this is important. Don't think this is not important to us as South Asians. This is important to us. So thank you very much for being here. And Gurpreet, thank you very much for doing the work you do.
Thank you, Ujjalji, for sharing your wisdom of thought and challenging the community leaders, whether they're religious organizations or other community-based organizations. The next person now I'd like to call upon is our friend, Dr. Patricia Anderson. Dr. Patricia Anderson is editor, author, and literacy consultant, and she has been a prominent support to Gurpreet, and she edited the book, Fighting Hatred with Love. Friends, now I'd like to call upon Dr. Anderson to come on the podium and say a few words. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anderson.
Thank you, Jay. Well, I must say that I am delighted to be here today and, above all, very honored to be able to witness the launch of this most important book and to share in commemorating the innocent people who lost their lives in the Air India bombing. Many of you might not be aware that this book had its beginnings as part of a larger project, a definitive account of the underlying cultural and political causes of the Air India disaster. In an editorial capacity, I have consulted with Gurpreet on this project for a number of years, possibly more years than he and I want to admit to anymore. As a result of this collaboration, I have been privileged to gain a new understanding of the rich Sikh culture and religion. Not to mention a more uncomfortable level of knowledge about the failings of the justice system and law enforcement, and about some of the more Byzantine, to say the least, aspects in the history of Canadian culture and politics. During the time that I've known Gurpreet and his work, I have been impressed with his dedication and unfailingly hard-working ethic, his perseverance, determination, in-depth research, journalistic diligence, and what I can only describe as his editor, as a terrier-like analysis of the historical, religious, cultural, and political complexities that sowed the seeds of the Air India bombing, or as Gurpreet designates it, Canada's 9/11. I first read the stories in this book in their original manuscript form and was at once struck by how brave and moving they are, because they represent really the single beacon of redemption and inspiration in an otherwise dark history of folly, hubris, ruthlessness, violence, and tragedy. It is more than fitting that these stories should be set apart in their own special book, and I am absolutely thrilled to see it here in print today. I hope this collection enjoys huge and deserved success, and I heartily commend Gurpreet and all of you who have shared your stories so generously and together created what is indeed a valuable contribution to intercultural understanding and the history of forgiveness. My sincere congratulations to Gurpreet and everyone involved in this wonderful and hope-bringing endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for providing your support to Gurpreet and particularly to this project, and bringing your message at this event. Now, another friend that I'd like to now invite is Kimball Carrero. Many of you know him. He's the editor with People's Voice. And Kimball has also helped Gurpreet with editing these books and took a major role in editing Defenders of Secularism. Friends, now I'd like to call upon Kimball Carrero to come to the podium and share a few of his words. Please join me in welcoming Kimball Carrero.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's been a great pleasure working with Gurpreet the last few years. I'd also like to share the sentiments expressed by the other speakers of sympathy and solidarity for the victims of terrorism in this country, of the Air India attack and other assaults. We've had many important, thought-provoking presentations here today. Some of them strike close to my own family story. I was moved by Charlie Smith's description of the era of white supremacy in this country. You know, my father's family were Métis living in the prairies, northern Saskatchewan, at a time when they eventually had to make a choice. Are we going to present ourselves to the world as Métis or as whites? And that was at a time when the first choice meant you lived in poverty. Your children didn't get education. You had the worst jobs. You lived on the outside of town in the worst houses. Most of them could pass as white, like me, so that's what they did. For 60 years, they denied their heritage because of that history of white supremacism in this country, and they did pretty well. But we lost something very important in this country, and journalists like Charlie and like Gurpreet are helping to restore a true picture of Canadian history, and doing it in a very courageous way. I remember when we were first approached to run one of Gurpreet's articles, and knowing who he was, I said, well, certainly, let's see what it is. And it was about one of the articles about Air India and that history. And a few weeks later, there was another one. And I thought to myself at the time, you know, here is a journalist who is speaking truth in ways that will be very uncomfortable for certain people who do not like to have that truth exposed. And these are people who have a history, a record of using threats and violence to suppress those who are speaking those uncomfortable truths. There could be consequences for those who write about such things and speak about such things and who print such things. And we had some experience with our own paper, with People's Voice. I remember going to work one day, it happened to be April the 20th, 1997, and there was an unusual thing by the mail slot outside my office. There's a pile of bullets and a note. 20 bullets. It was April the 20th, 1997, which happened to be the anniversary of Adolf Hitler's birthday. And the note was from white supremacists, thugs, gangsters, the type of people who think it's a brave thing for the white race to beat up a Sikh grandfather out for a walk in the park and kill someone like that. That's their idea of courage. Well, we showed this to the police. The police said, oh, maybe you should shut down your office for a while. Don't go to work. So what are you going to do to protect us? Nothing. So we kept working. We're not going to bow down to threats. I don't think journalists like Gurpreet will ever bow down to such threats. because these things have to be written about. We have to speak the truth about racism in our society, about the attacks by fundamentalist forces who would try and impose a very narrow set of views and practices and ideas upon society as a whole. These are things which we cannot allow. In a democratic society, we have to resist these attacks. So we're very proud to run Gurpreet's articles. And we're very proud that he takes a progressive, pro-working class position in many of his articles. It's wonderful for us, for example, to have people write about the history of those like Darshan Singh Canadian, the communist organizer of the woodworkers. This is an important history that Canadians should know. And we have a long way to go in this society still. We're not completely over the era of white supremacism by a long shot. We're not over other forms of domination which would attempt to impose certain white Christian heterosexist values upon our society. We have much work to be done. And we'll continue to work with Gurpreet. We're delighted to have had some hand in helping to edit his articles, and we'll continue to do that. And I want to thank him personally. It's been an honor and a privilege. Thank you, Gurpreet.
Thank you, Kimball, for your support to Gurpreet, but more importantly, for your support to the progressive and silent voices. Thank you. Friends, that brings to the conclusion of our formal presentation. Gurpreet had also received calls from some of our friends who would like to say a few words in solidarity with families. I will now read out their names and ask them to say a few words. In order, I have the names as follows. Pandit D.P. Dwivedi ji. After that will be Mr. Surinder Sangha, then Kashmir Taliwal, Nadeem Parmar, Dr. Sadhu Singh, Amrit Diwana, and Satish Gulati. Before I call on these speakers, a couple of organizations have also stepped forward and showed their support and sympathy, and I would like to acknowledge them for taking the time and being here. The first organization I'm going to acknowledge is Mahalakshmi Narayan Temple, whose president Prashodham Goyal and General Secretary Vinay and other members are also here. I also want to acknowledge Committee of Progressive Pakistani Canadians who are here to show their solidarity with families. And Shahzad Nazir Khan and other members of this organization are here. Shahzad has also been very helpful in putting this event together. I want to really acknowledge the support that you have always given. And the other organization who is here is Shri 108 Sant Sarwan Das Charitable Trust. Their convener, Vrinder Bangar, is here. That organization is here in solidarity, but also was affected by fundamentalism. As some of you may know, they lost their religious leader who was preaching in Vienna, Austria, a few years ago. And while he was preaching, he was shot to death, and another preacher was injured. So these are the organizations. I know there are a number of other organizations who are here in solidarity, and I wanted to acknowledge everyone and every organization that is here for being with us. Now I'd like to call upon Pandit Dwivedi ji, who's a scholar of Hinduism. Okay, so regrets from him. The next speaker now I would like to call upon is Surinder Sangha, President of the Indo-Canadian Workers Association, who has always taken time to pay respect and tributes, and they have also organized events in memory of victims of Air India tragedy. Please join me in welcoming Surinder Sangha.
ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਸਮਾਗਮ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਕੱਤਰ ਹੋਏ ਸਾਰੇ ਸਾਥੀਓ, ਭੈਣਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਭਰਾਓ, ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਅੱਜ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਸਮਾਗਮ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਹੁਣੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਮਿਹਨਤ ਕਰਕੇ 2 ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਛਾਪੀਆਂ, ਮੈਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧਾਈ ਦਿੰਦਾ। ਅਤੇ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਛਾਪਣ ਲਈ ਮਿਹਨਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਉਹਦੇ 'ਚ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਮੀਟਿੰਗ ਆ, ਇਹ ਸਿਰਫ ਮੀਟਿੰਗ ਸੁਣ ਕੇ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਘਰ ਨੂੰ ਚਲੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡਾ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਫਰਜ਼ ਬਣਦਾ, ਜਿਹੜੇ 2 ਇਸ਼ੂ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨੇ ਉਠਾਲਣ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਡਾਕੂਮੈਂਟ ਕੀਤੇ ਆ, ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਵੱਡੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਆ। ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਬੁੱਕ ਆ ਰਹੀ ਆ, ਉਹਦੇ 'ਚ ਸਾਰੀ ਡਿਟੇਲ 'ਚ ਸਾਰੀ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਮਿਲਣੀ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਅੱਜ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਅਹਿਦ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਮੈਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਦੇ ਵਿਰੁੱਧ ਨਹੀਂ ਬੋਲਦਾ, ਇੱਥੇ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਾਰਾ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਲਪਰੇਟ ਆ ਏਅਰ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ, ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਅੱਜ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਸੜਕਾਂ 'ਤੇ ਛਾਤੀਆਂ ਕੱਢੀ ਫਿਰਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਫੜਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਨਾਕਾਮ ਰਿਹਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਮੱਥੇ 'ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਕਲੰਕ ਆ। ਉਦ ਤੱਕ ਉਹ ਕਲੰਕੇ ਧੋ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਕਦੇ ਜਦ ਤੱਕ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਫੜ ਕੇ ਕੋਰਟ ਦੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਯੋਗ ਸਜ਼ਾਵਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੱਤੀਆਂ ਜਾ ਸਕਦੀਆਂ। ਹੁਣ ਦੇਖੋ, ਏਅਰ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੀਆਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵਿਕਟਮਸ ਆ, ਉਹਨੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਫ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਉਹ ਕੀਤਾ। ਕੀ ਉਹਨੇ ਉਹ ਮਾਫ ਕਰਤਾ? ਉਹਦੇ ਕਰਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਮੰਨ ਕੇ ਬਹਿ ਜਾਈਏ ਵੀ ਹੁਣ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੀਆਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਸਬਕ ਸਿੱਖਾਂਗੇ, ਇਹ ਘਟਨਾਵਾਂ ਹੋਣ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੇਵਾਂਗੇ। ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਯੁੱਗ ਵਿੱਚ ਵਾਰਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਖਾਂਦੀ। ਅੱਜ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦਾ ਅਹਿਦ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਭਾਵੇਂ 27 ਸਾਲ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਇਸ ਘਟਨਾ ਹੋਈ ਨੂੰ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਹਨੀ ਇਹ ਪਸ਼ੂ ਬਿਰਤੀ ਵਾਲਾ ਕਾਰਾ ਕੀਤਾ, ਕੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਸਜ਼ਾਵਾਂ ਨਾ ਦੇ ਸਕੀਏ? ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਕਹਿਣ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਝਿਜਕ ਨਹੀਂ। ਜੇ ਇਹੋ ਹੀ ਜਹਾਜ਼ ਸਾਡੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਨਾਲ ਭਰਿਆ ਨਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ, ਇਹ 'ਚ ਹੋਰ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੀ ਮੈਜੋਰਟੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੁੰਦੀ, ਉਹ ਕਲਪਰੇਟ ਉਸੇ ਵੇਲੇ ਫੜ ਹੋ ਜਾਣੇ ਸੀ। ਉਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰਧਾਨ ਮੰਤਰੀ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਰਾਜੀਵ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਦਾ ਅਫਸੋਸ ਪ੍ਰਗਟ ਕੀਤਾ, ਕੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਦੋਂ ਉਸ ਟ੍ਰੈਜਡੀ ਨੂੰ ਮੰਨਿਆ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਟ੍ਰੈਜਡੀ ਸੀ? ਅੱਜ ਜੌਨ ਮੇਜਰ ਦੀ ਰਿਪੋਰਟ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮੰਨਣ ਲੱਗ ਪਏ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਟ੍ਰੈਜਡੀ ਸੀ। ਇੰਨਾ ਚਿਰ ਲਾਤਾ। ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਭੁੱਲਣਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਭਾਵੇਂ ਟਾਈਮ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਅਗਾਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਰਹੇ, ਪਰ ਉਸ ਕਾਰੇ ਨੂੰ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਲੇ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਲਿਆਉਣ ਲਈ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਆਪਣੇ ਯਤਨ ਹੋਰ ਤੇਜ਼ ਕਰਨੇ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਆ। ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦੀ ਕਮਿਟਮੈਂਟ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਸ ਡੋਰ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਜਾਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਜਿਹੜੀ ਦੂਜੀ ਗੱਲ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਦੂਜੀ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਨਹੀਂ ਲਿਖੀ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਡਿਫੈਂਡਰਸ ਆਫ ਸੈਕੂਲਰਿਜ਼ਮ, ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਆ ਉਹ ਹੋਰ ਸੀਰੀਅਸ ਆ। ਅੱਜ ਜੋ ਵਰਤਾਰਾ ਸਾਡੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ 'ਚ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਇੰਡੋ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ 'ਚ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ, ਤੇ ਹੋਰ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਹੋ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਇੱਥੇ ਦੇ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਸ਼ੀਅਨ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪੱਠੇ ਪਾਉਂਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਕੋਲ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਵੋਟਾਂ ਮੰਗਦੇ ਆ। ਮੈਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ, ਉਹਨੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਖੀਸੇ 'ਚ ਵੋਟਾਂ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਪਾਈਆਂ? ਉਹ ਵੋਟਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕਹੇ 'ਤੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਾਉਂਦੇ। ਇਹ ਰਿਵਾਜ਼ ਛੱਡ ਦਿਓ। ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲ ਆ ਸਮਝਣ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਆ। ਉਸ ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਅੱਜ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਅਹਿਦ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਇੰਨਾ ਸ਼ਾਨਦਾਰ ਮੁਲਕ ਆ, ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਨੂੰ ਹੋਰ ਸ਼ਾਨਦਾਰ ਬਣਾਉਣ ਲਈ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੰਡੋ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁਣ ਹੈ, ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਹੁਣ ਕਿਹਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਆ। ਸਾਡਾ ਵੀ ਉਨਾ ਹੀ ਹੱਕ ਆ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਹੋਰਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਆ। ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਨੂੰ ਬਿਹਤਰ ਬਣਾਉਣ ਲਈ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸੈਕੂਲਰ ਫੋਰਸਸ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਜ਼ਬੂਤ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਅੱਜ ਡਟ ਕੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਪਣਾ ਅਹਿਦ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਾਈਏ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨੇ ਮੈਸੇਜ ਕਨਵੇ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਉਸ ਮੈਸੇਜ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਲੋਕ ਲੀਡਿੰਗ ਲੋਕ ਬੈਠੇ ਆ, ਲੀਡਰ ਟਰਾਈਬ ਲੋਕ ਬੈਠੇ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਬੜੀ ਫੋਲੋ ਆ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ 'ਚ। ਅੱਜ ਅਹਿਦ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਾਈਏ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਫੋਰਸਜ਼ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਭਾਈਚਾਰੇ ਦਾ ਨਾਮ ਬਦਨਾਮ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਮੌਕਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਖੁਜਾਉਣੀਆਂ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਐਕਸਪੋਜ਼ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਅੱਜ ਆਪਾਂ ਅਹਿਦ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਾਈਏ। ਇਹੋ ਹੀ ਸਾਡੀ ਸੱਚੀ ਸ਼ਰਧਾਂਜਲੀ ਆ ਏਰੀਆ ਦੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵਿਕਟਮਸ ਨੂੰ। ਇੰਨੇ ਹੀ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਮੈਂ ਫਿਰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਆਸ ਰੱਖਦਾ, ਜੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਤੋਂ ਕੋਈ ਲਫ਼ਜ਼ ਕੋਈ ਸਖਤੀ ਵਾਲਾ ਕਹਿ ਗਿਆ ਹੋਵੇ ਉਹ ਆਪਾਂ ਮਾਫ ਕਰਨਾ। ਤੇ ਬਾਕੀ ਅਹਿਦ ਕਰਨੇ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਆ, ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਮੀਟਿੰਗ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਸਾਲ ਵੀ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਦੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਉਹਦੇ 'ਚ ਮੇਜਰ ਹੋਣੀ ਸਾਰੇ ਆਏ ਸੀ। ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਮਸਲੇ ਨੂੰ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਛੱਡਾਂਗੇ। ਇੱਕ ਮੈਂ ਗੱਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੋਰ ਕਰਨੀ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ, ਪਾਰਲੀਮੈਂਟ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜਾ 84 ਦਿੱਲੀ ਜੋ ਕਤਲੇਆਮ ਹੋਇਆ, ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਦੀ ਡਟ ਕੇ ਨਿਖੇਧੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ। ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਕਤਲੇਆਮਾਂ ਦੀ ਤਾਂ ਪਾਰਲੀਮੈਂਟ ਦੀ ਪਟੀਸ਼ਨਾਂ ਜਾਨੀਆਂ। ਹੁਣ ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਪਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਕੱਢ ਕੇ ਸਾਈਨ ਕਰਾਈਏ ਕਿ ਉਹੀ MP, ਉਹੀ ਮੈਂਬਰ ਪਾਰਲੀਮੈਂਟ, ਉਹੀ ਪਾਰਟੀਆਂ ਉੱਠ ਕੇ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ ਪਟੀਸ਼ਨਾਂ ਵੀ ਉੱਥੇ ਰੱਖਣਗੀਆਂ ਵੀ ਏਅਰ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਕਾਤਲਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਫੜ ਕੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਲਿਆਓ। ਇਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਥੇ ਬਚਣ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਆ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਜੋ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਸ਼ੀਅਨ ਆਪਣੇ ਹਿੱਤਾਂ ਦੀ ਖਾਤਰ ਯੂਜ਼ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਉਹ ਤੋਂ ਵਰਜਿਤ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਲੋਕ ਸਾਡੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਜੜ ਵਾਂਗੂ ਵਰਤ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਫਾਇਦੇ ਕੱਢਦੇ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਲਿਆਉਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ, ਸਮਝਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇੰਨੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਸਾਂਝੇ ਕਰਨ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ।
Thank you, Mr. Sangaji. I just wanted to say that I really want to acknowledge and appreciate all the speakers who have been very mindful of the time, and that has helped us to stay pretty much on schedule. So we have about 4 or 5 other speakers, and I would also encourage them to be mindful of the time. We got about 10-15 more minutes, and then at about 4:20, we'll be asking Gurpreet to come on the podium and say a few words. So I would request the next few speakers to be also mindful of the time and limit their message to 2 to 3 minutes. The next speaker I would now like to call upon is our friend Kashmir Taliwal, who is the past president of Khalsa Diwan Society, Vancouver. He's left. Okay, that's great. That gives us a couple more minutes for each speaker. He's so I don't have to be that strict anymore. So next person who had expressed interest in saying a few words and show his solidarity is our friend Nadeem Parmar. Please join me in welcoming Nadeem. As most of you know, that Nadeem is also not a strange face to all of us. He's a prominent voice. You're very much familiar with his famous ghazals, and in addition to that, he's also a strong critic of literature. And it's a pleasure for me to now call upon Nadeem to say a few words. Oh, great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear friends, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Gurpreet for his courage to write these 2 books. I have read these 2 books. The most important thing in this book is the stories of the victim families, plus the other book about a few friends like Darshan, Gil, Ujjal, and I think it's one of the writers, Kathy Osler from Calgary. She has also written a book on this, not Air India, but the 84 massacre in Delhi. And it's a very popular book called Karma. I'm not promoting that book but I just want to tell you guys that it's not only the journalist, but there are writers who write fiction, writer who writes prose or articles. They are also doing that. They should be doing this one also. Personally, I have written 2 books, 2 novels based on this Air India crash, and their characteristics of those peoples. I don't want to say which peoples, as Ujjal said, faith leaders, their backgrounds, and what they do in the behind, what they have done to our society. And I'll quote you the one line from one of my character. He says that these people not only raped the Indo-Canadian or Punjabi community or Indian community in particular, but they have raped the whole Canadian community. With these 2 words, I would like to thank you. Please read those 2 books. You will get a lot of information in those 2 books. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nadeem ji. Now I would like to call upon another critic, another friend of ours, who's also a writer, and he is Dr. Sadhu Singh. It's my pleasure to now call upon Dr. Sadhu Singh to come to the podium and say a few words. Dr. Sadhu Singh.
ਪਿਆਰੇ ਦੋਸਤੋ, ਕੁਝ ਫਿਕਰੇ ਕਹਿਣੇ ਆ। ਪਹਿਲਾ ਇਹ ਕਿ ਦਹਿਸ਼ਤਗਰਦ ਹਿੰਦੂ, ਸਿੱਖ ਜਾਂ ਮੁਸਲਮਾਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੇ। ਦਹਿਸ਼ਤਗਰਦਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਧਰਮ ਹੁੰਦਾ, ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਜ਼ਾਤ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ। ਉਹ ਅਧਰਮੀ ਔਰ ਬਦਜ਼ਾਤ ਬੰਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ। ਜੇ ਫਰਜ਼ ਕਰੋ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਕਰਤੂਤਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਰੱਖਾਂ, ਮੇਰੇ ਲਈ ਉਸਮਾ ਬਿਨ ਲਾਦਨ ਅਤੇ ਸੰਤ ਜਰਨੈਲ ਸਿੰਘ ਭਿੰਡਰਾਂਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਕਰਮ ਇੱਕ ਸਮਾਨ ਆ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਬਾਹਰਲੀ ਦਿੱਖ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਕਾਫੀ ਸਮਾਨਤਾ, ਪਰਲੇ ਬਾਹਰਲੀ ਦਿੱਖ ਜੇ ਵੱਖਰੀ ਵੀ ਹੋਵੇ, ਲੇਕਿਨ ਜਿਸ ਕਿਸਮ ਦਾ ਡਰੈਸ ਕੋਡ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਭੈੜੇ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੰਤ ਭਿੰਡਰਾਂਵਾਲੇ ਅਤੇ ਉਹਦੀਆਂ ਪਤਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਫੌਜਾਂ ਨੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਰੀ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ, ਜਿਸ ਕਿਸਮ ਦਾ ਪ੍ਰੈਸ ਕੋਡ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਾਰੀ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ, ਜਿਸ ਕਿਸਮ ਦੀ ਖਾਣ ਪੀਣ, ਪਹਿਨਣ, ਬੋਲਣ, ਲਿਖਣ, ਪੜ੍ਹਨ, ਸੋਚਣ 'ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਬੰਦਸ਼ ਲਾਈ ਸੀ, ਉਹੀ ਤਾਲਬਾਨ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ। ਸੋ ਪਹਿਲੀ ਤਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਇਹ ਕਿ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਦਰਿੰਦੇ ਆਖਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਵੀ ਮੇਰਾ ਮਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਭਰਦਾ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਦਰਿੰਦਾ, ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਜੰਗਲੀ ਜਾਨਵਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੇਖੋਗੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਪਣੀ ਹੀ ਜਿਣਸ ਦੇ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੰਨੀ ਮੰਦਭਾਵਨਾ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਤਲ ਕਰੇ। ਸੋ ਪਹਿਲੀ ਤਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਇਹ ਕਿ ਮੇਰੀ ਜ਼ਬਾਨ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉੱਦਾਂ ਆਮ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਕਾਫੀ ਸਮਰਿੱਧ ਆ, ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੀ ਦਰਿੰਦਗੀ ਨੂੰ ਜਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਕਰਤੂਤਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਣ ਲਈ ਢੁਕਵੇਂ ਲਫ਼ਜ਼ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲ ਰਹੇ। ਦੂਜੀ ਗੱਲ, ਮੈਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਲਾਮ ਕਰਦਾ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਰਾਹੀਂ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਡਰੈਸ ਕੋਡ ਨੂੰ ਅਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰੈਸ ਕੋਡ ਨੂੰ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਹੁਕਮਨਾਮਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਹੋਰ ਸਭ ਕਾਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਰੱਦ ਕਰਕੇ ਸੁਤੰਤਰਤਾ ਦਾ ਝੰਡਾ ਬਰਕਰਾਰ ਰੱਖਿਆ। ਅਤੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਤਕਲੀਫ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦੀ, ਜਿਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਮੈਂ ਇਸ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਦੇ ਟਾਈਟਲ ਵੱਲ ਵੀ ਦੇਖਦਾ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਬਹੁਤੇ ਬੰਦੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਨਿਕਟਵਰਤੀ ਦੋਸਤ ਨਹੀਂ। ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਿਕਟਵਰਤੀ ਅਜ਼ੀਜ਼ ਰਿਹਾ। ਐਡੇ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤ ਇਨਸਾਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰਨ ਵਾਲੇ ਬੰਦੇ ਕਿਹੋ ਜਿਹੇ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ, ਮੈਂ ਇਹ ਸੋਚਣੋਂ ਇਨਕਾਰੀ ਹਾਂ। ਮੈਂ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਦੀ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਦੇ ਬਹਾਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰ ਫੇਰ ਦਰਸ਼ਨ ਸਿੰਘ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਵਰਗੇ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ, ਪਾਸ਼ ਵਰਗੇ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਲਾਮ ਕਰਦਾ। ਅਤੇ ਦੂਜੀ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਸ ਕਿਸਮ ਦੇ ਦਰਿੰਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਸੀਮਤ ਸੋਚ ਉਹ ਦੇਖ ਲਓ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਬੰਦਾ ਸੰਤ ਹਰਚੰਦ ਸਿੰਘ ਭਿੰਡਰਾਂਵਾਲੇ ਨੂੰ ਗੁਰੂ ਗ੍ਰੰਥ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਦੀ ਹਾਜ਼ਰੀ 'ਚ ਮਾਰ ਸਕਦਾ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਿੱਖ ਦਹਿਸ਼ਤਗਰਦ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ। ਇਕੱਲਾ ਹੀ ਦਹਿਸ਼ਤਗਰਦ ਭਰਾਵੋ ਕਹਿ ਲਓ, ਸਿੱਖ ਨਾ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਕਹੋ। ਦੂਜੀ ਗੱਲ, ਅਖੀਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੈਂ ਕੁਛ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਜ਼ਿਕਰ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਬੱਬੀ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਦੀ ਸੱਸ ਮਾਤਾ ਦੇ ਪਿਤਾ ਵੀ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਸੰਗਤ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਮਾਣ ਵੀ ਮਿਲਿਆ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਾਮ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਤੇਰਾ ਸਿੰਘ ਚੰਨ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਯਾਦ ਦੇ ਵਸੀਲੇ ਮੈਂ ਸਿਰਫ ਇੱਕ ਗੱਲ ਕਹਿਣੀ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਜਿੰਨੀਆਂ ਅਗਾਂਹ ਵਧੂ ਮਾਨਵਵਾਦੀ ਕਦਰਾਂ ਕੀਮਤਾਂ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਿਰਫ ਆਪਣੇ ਦਿਲੋਂ ਦਿਮਾਗ ਦਾ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਹੀ ਨਾ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਕਰੋ, ਬਲਕਿ ਆਪਣੇ ਅਮਲ ਵਿੱਚ, ਆਪਣੇ ਨਿੱਤ ਦੇ ਵਿਹਾਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਧਾਰਨ ਕਰੋ। ਅਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਇਸ ਆਦਮੀ ਨੂੰ ਸਲਾਮ ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਕਰਦਾ ਕਿ ਇਹਦੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ, ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਵੱਖ-ਵੱਖ ਧਰਮਾਂ ਅਤੇ ਜ਼ਾਤਾਂ ਅਤੇ ਗੋਤਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵਿਆਹਿਆ ਹੋਆ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਰਾਹ 'ਚ ਕਦੇ ਰੁਕਾਵਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਬਣਿਆ। ਮੈਂ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰ ਫਿਰ ਚਲੋ ਮੈਂ ਗੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਐਵੇਂ ਲੰਬੀ ਨਾ ਕਰਾਂ। ਸੋ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਪ੍ਰਗਤੀਸ਼ੀਲ ਅੰਸ਼ ਆਪਣੇ ਜ਼ਿਹਨ ਅਤੇ ਜਜ਼ਬਾਤ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਕੱਢ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਚਰਿੱਤਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਤੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਅਮਲ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਲੈ ਆਇਆ ਕਰੋ। ਸੋ ਦੋਸਤੋ, ਇਸ ਮਸਲੇ ਬਾਰੇ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ 'ਚੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਜਾ ਸਕਦੀਆਂ, ਪਰ ਵਕਤ ਦੀ ਤੰਗੀ ਨੂੰ ਸਲਾਮ ਅਤੇ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨੂੰ ਸਲਾਮ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਕਰਮ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਡੇ ਮਤਲਬ ਧਿਆਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਿਆਂਦਾ। ਅਤੇ ਨਾਲੇ ਮੈਂ ਉਜਲ ਦਸਾਂਝ ਅਤੇ ਦਰਸ਼ਨ ਗਿੱਲ ਵਰਗੇ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਇਸੇ ਕਰਕੇ ਸਲਾਮ ਕਰਦਾ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਦੇਸ਼ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਲਮ ਅਤੇ ਜ਼ੁਬਾਨ ਦੀ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਨੂੰ ਬੁਲੰਦ ਰੱਖਣ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਹੌਸਲਾ ਕੀਤਾ। ਮਿਹਰਬਾਨੀ।
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadhuji, for reminding us that terrorism have no religion, and we need to always be mindful of that. And also, that's consistent with what Ujjal had said, that we need to create societies where everyone should be able to have and practice whatever they believe in, as long as it's not impacting on your personal life. So I want to acknowledge both of you for leaving these messages. The next speaker I would now like to call upon is also a well-known writer, poet. He is Amrit Diwana. Is Amrit here? Yeah. Okay, great. Amrit had written a poem on the victims of Air India, and I understand when he first wrote it, he talked to Gurpreet. And pretty much on that same day, Gurpreet became very interested and impressed by the poem, and Gurpreet hosted a special 2-hour show on his radio. So this speaks to the caliber of his poetry, and also the dedication and commitment to getting the justice for the victims of Air India. Please join me in welcoming Amrit Diwana.
ਦੋਸਤੋ, ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਹੀ ਅਜਿਹਾ ਇੱਕ ਪੱਤਰਕਾਰ ਹੈ ਜਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਬੇਗਾਨੀ ਅੱਗ ਦਾ ਸੇਕ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਸ਼ੌਕ ਹੈ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੋਨਾਂ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ। ਦੋਸਤੋ, ਜਿਸ ਦਿਨ ਕਨਿਕਸ਼ਕ ਜਹਾਜ਼ ਡਿੱਗਣ ਬਾਰੇ ਫੈਸਲਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ ਵੈਨਕੂਵਰ ਕੋਰਟ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਸ ਫੈਸਲੇ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਮੈਂ ਬਤੌਰ ਇੱਕ ਕਵੀ ਸੋਚਿਆ ਕਿ ਅੱਜ ਉਸ ਫੈਸਲੇ ਦਾ ਸਮੁੰਦਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੀ ਪ੍ਰਤੀਕਰਮ ਹੋਇਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਆਮ ਇੱਕ ਮਿੱਥ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਕੁਛ ਆਤਮਾਵਾਂ ਹੁੰਦੀਆਂ ਮਰ ਜਾਂਦੀਆਂ ਹਨ ਅਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮੁਕਤੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੀ, ਉਹ ਇੱਧਰ ਉੱਧਰ ਫਿਰਦੀਆਂ ਹਨ। ਅਤੇ ਸਮੁੰਦਰ 'ਚ ਕੀ ਪ੍ਰਤੀਕਰਮ ਹੋਇਆ ਉਸ ਫੈਸਲੇ ਦਾ, ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਚੰਦ ਲਾਈਨਾਂ। ਮਹਾਸਾਗਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਭਟਕਦੀਆਂ ਹੋਈਆਂ ਰੂਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਜੁੜ ਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਫੇਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ ਬਿਰਲਾਪ। ਮਹਾਸਾਗਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਭਟਕਦੀਆਂ ਹੋਈਆਂ ਰੂਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਜੁੜ ਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਫੇਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ ਬਿਰਲਾਪ। ਥਰ-ਥਰਾ ਗਈ ਹੋਵੇਗੀ ਚਫੇਰੇ ਦੀ ਕਾਇਨਾਤ। ਥਰ-ਥਰਾ ਗਈ ਹੋਵੇਗੀ ਚਫੇਰੇ ਦੀ ਕਾਇਨਾਤ। ਫਿਰ ਪਾਣੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਸੱਥਰ ਵਿਛਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ, ਲਹਿਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਾਂਬਾ ਛਿੜਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਫਿਰ ਪਾਣੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਸੱਥਰ ਵਿਛਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ, ਲਹਿਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਾਂਬਾ ਛਿੜਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਜੋਗਾ ਅੰਬਰ ਡੁਸਕਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ, ਇੱਕ ਸੋਗੀ ਜਿਹਾ ਮੰਜ਼ਰ ਬਿਲਕਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਜੀ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਜੋਗਾ ਅੰਬਰ ਡੁਸਕਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ, ਇੱਕ ਸੋਗੀ ਜਿਹਾ ਮੰਜ਼ਰ ਬਿਲਕਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਪੌਣਾ ਨੇ ਰਲ ਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਬੈਣ ਪਾਇਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਪੌਣਾ ਨੇ ਰਲ ਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਬੈਣ ਪਾਇਆ ਹੋਏਗਾ। ਮੋਏ ਨਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਮਰਸੀਆ ਗਾਇਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਮੋਏ ਨਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਮਰਸੀਆ ਗਾਇਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਮਹਾਸਾਗਰ ਦੀ ਪਾਣੀਆਂ 'ਚ ਅੱਜ ਫੇਰ ਸੱਥਰ ਵਿਛਿਆ ਹੈ, ਫੇਰ ਸੱਥਰ ਵਿਛੇਗਾ। ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ।
Thank you, Amarji, for sharing this beautiful poem. Now I would call upon our friend Satish Gulati. Satish, he's with the Chetna Prakashan, the publication company who had the privilege to publish these two books. After Satish, I will call upon Sadhu Benning. So now please join me in welcoming Satish Gulati.
ਪ੍ਰਧਾਨਗੀ ਮੰਡਲ ਤੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਬੈਠੇ ਸਤਿਕਾਰ ਦੋਸਤੋ, ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਮੁਬਾਰਕ ਦਿੰਦਾ ਔਰ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦੀ ਅਤਿਅੰਤ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਸ਼ਿਤ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਮੌਕਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਿਆ। ਕਰੀਬ 3 ਮਹੀਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨਾਲ, ਵੈਸੇ ਤਾਂ ਪਿਛਲੇ 5-6 ਸਾਲ ਤੋਂ ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ, ਲੇਕਿਨ 3 ਮਹੀਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਇਹ ਫਾਈਨਲ ਹੋਇਆ ਕਿ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਤਿਆਰ ਨੇ, ਸਾਰਾ ਕੁਝ ਮੈਟਰ ਫਾਈਨਲ। ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਜਲਦੀ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਭੇਜ ਦਿਓ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਜੂਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਥੇ ਬੁੱਕ ਫੇਅਰ ਲਗਾਉਣਾ ਅਤੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਅਵੇਲੇਬਲ ਹੋਣੀਆਂ ਚਾਹੀਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਔਰ ਉਹ ਮੌਕਾ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਬੜੀ ਜਲਦੀ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਔਰ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅਕਸਰ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਤੋਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਸ਼ਿਤ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਆਉਂਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਪਹਿਲੀ ਵਾਰ ਹੋਇਆ ਕਿ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਤੋਂ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਦੀ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਇੱਥੇ ਰਿਲੀਜ਼ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਮਾਣ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ। ਔਰ ਦੂਜਾ, ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦੀ ਅਤਿਅੰਤ ਹੋਰ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਹੈ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਲਈ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ 5-4 ਮਹੀਨੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ 2 ਲੈਂਗੁਏਜ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਨੁਵਾਦ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਵੀ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਸ਼ਿਤ ਹੋ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਨੇ, ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਔਰ ਹਿੰਦੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਸ਼ਾਇਦ 5-6 ਮਹੀਨੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਔਰ ਇੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਰਿਲੀਜ਼ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਔਰ ਆਖਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਕ ਸ਼ੇਰ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲ ਖਤਮ ਕਰਨਾ ਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਤੱਕ ਸ਼ਬਦ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਜਦੋਂ ਤੱਕ ਅਰਥ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਜਦੋਂ ਤੱਕ ਸ਼ਬਦ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਜਦੋਂ ਤੱਕ ਅਰਥ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਪਤਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਰ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਅੰਬਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਭਾਲ ਹੋ ਜਾਵੇ। ਜਦੋਂ ਤੱਕ ਸ਼ਬਦ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਜਦੋਂ ਤੱਕ ਅਰਥ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਪਤਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਰ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਅੰਬਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਭਾਲ ਹੋ ਜਾਵੇ। ਔਰ ਤੂੰ ਆਪਣੀ ਚੁੱਪ ਤੋੜਨ ਦਾ ਜਰਾ ਕੁ ਹੌਸਲਾ ਕਰ ਲੈ ਕਿ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ ਸਾਰਾ ਮੁਲਕ ਤੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੋ ਜਾਵੇ।
Thank you, Satish ji, for departing with those wonderful words. Now, friends, I would like to call upon our another friend, Sadhu Benning, who is also not a stranger to us. Sadhu Benning. Thank you.
ਬਹੁਤ ਮਿਹਰਬਾਨੀ। ਮੈਂ ਅਖੀਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਮਾਂ ਲਿਆ, ਬਹੁਤ ਸੰਖੇਪ ਗੱਲ ਕਰੂੰਗਾ ਮੈਂ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੀ ਆਵਾਜ਼ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਰਲਾਉਣੀ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੰਮ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਐਪਰੀਸ਼ੀਏਟ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਜਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮਤਲਬ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਬੜੇ ਹੌਸਲੇ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਸੱਚਮੁੱਚ ਹੀ ਹੌਸਲੇ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ ਜਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਆਪਣਾ ਜਰਨਲਿਜ਼ਮ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਰੇਡੀਓ ਰਾਹੀਂ, ਅਤੇ ਜਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਜੋ ਕੁਛ ਲਿਖਦਾ ਹੈਗਾ। ਮੈਂ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਦੇ ਕੁਛ ਹਿੱਸੇ ਜੇ ਪੜ੍ਹੇ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਦੂਜੀ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਬਾਰੇ ਵੀ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ, ਮਤਲਬ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕੁਛ ਉਹਦੇ ਮੈਂ ਲੇਖ ਪੜ੍ਹੇ ਆ। ਦੋ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਖਾਸ ਸੁਨੇਹੇ ਮਿਲਦੇ ਆ, ਇੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਕਿ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਵਿਕਟਮ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਫੈਮਲੀਆਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਉੱਭਰਦੀ ਆ ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਰੇਸਿਜ਼ਮ ਹੋਇਆ, ਨਸਲਵਾਦ ਹੋਇਆ। ਇਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਲੋਕ ਮੰਨਦੇ ਵੀ ਆ ਵੀ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਜਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਕੇਸ ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੈਂਡਲ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਉਹ ਨਸਲਵਾਦ ਆ। ਸੋ ਜੇ ਇਹ ਹੁਣ ਮਤਲਬ ਇਹ ਠੀਕ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਆ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਕੁਛ ਲੋਕ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧੀਆ ਗੱਲ ਆ, ਪਰ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਇਹ ਠੀਕ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਅਜੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ। ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਦੀ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਆ ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਪੁਲ ਬਣ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਸਾਡੀ ਗਾਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਨਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਲਈ ਵੀ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਬਾਹਰਲੀ ਵੱਡੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਮਹੱਤਵਪੂਰਨ ਗੱਲ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਮੈਸੇਜ ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਦੋਨਾਂ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਹੈਗਾ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜੜ੍ਹ ਜਿੱਥੋਂ ਇਹ ਸਮੱਸਿਆ ਆਈ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਹੈਗਾ ਧਰਮ। ਅਤੇ ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਲੇ ਦੁਆਲੇ ਦੇਖੀਏ ਸਾਰੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਮੁਲਕ ਵਧੀਆ ਉੱਥੇ ਜੀਵਨ ਹੈਗਾ, ਇੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਇਸੇ ਕਰਕੇ ਵਧੀਆ ਜੀਵਨ ਹੈਗਾ ਵੀ ਧਰਮ ਅਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਟੇਟ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪਾਵਰ ਆ, ਅਸਲੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤਾਕਤ ਆ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਵਿੱਥ ਹੋਵੇ ਉਨਾ ਹੀ ਕੋਈ ਮੁਲਕ ਵਧੀਆ ਹੋਊਗਾ, ਉਨਾ ਹੀ ਉਹ ਸਮਾਜ ਵਧੀਆ ਹੋਊਗਾ। ਸੋ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਜੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਮੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਵੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਵਾਰ-ਵਾਰ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ, ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਦੇ ਤੌਰ 'ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਆ, ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ, ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਕੁਛ ਹੱਦ ਤੱਕ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਸੀ ਹੁਣ ਇਹ ਬਦਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਜੋ ਕੁਛ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਵਾਰ-ਵਾਰ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਿਆਸਤਦਾਨ ਆ ਉਹ ਕਿਉਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਿਆਂ 'ਚ, ਮੰਦਿਰਾਂ 'ਚ, ਮਸੀਤਾਂ 'ਚ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਉਹ ਵਿੱਥ ਘਟਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਆ, ਇਹ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਲਈ ਖਤਰੇ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਆ। ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਵੀ ਜਿਸ ਕਿਸਮ ਦੀ ਧਰਮ ਨੂੰ ਸਟੇਟ ਤੋਂ ਇਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਇਮਦਾਦ ਮਿਲਦੀ ਆ ਟੈਕਸ ਦੇ ਰਾਹੀਂ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਵੀ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵੱਲ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੇਖਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਇਹ ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਬਦਲਾਉਣੇ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਆ। ਜਿਹੜੀ ਐਜੂਕੇਸ਼ਨ ਆ ਜਿਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਧਰਮ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਥੇ ਵਾੜਿਆ ਜਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਐਜੂਕੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਮਤਲਬ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਲਈ ਸੋਚਣ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਆ। ਅਸੀਂ ਜੇ ਸਮਾਜ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਸੋਹਣਾ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਰੱਖਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਜੇ ਗਾਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਦਾ ਰੱਖਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਅਸੀਂ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਸਾਡੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧੀਆ ਜੀਵਨ ਜੀਣ, ਤਾਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਧਰਮ ਆ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਉਹਦੇ ਥਾਂ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਜਾਵੇ। ਆਪੋ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮੰਨਣਾ, ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਵੀ ਮੰਨਣਾ, ਆਪਣੀ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਨਾਲ ਮੰਨਣ, ਵੀ ਉਹ ਇਸ ਕਿਸਮ ਦੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਸਪੇਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ। ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੋਨਾਂ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਅਤੇ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਦੀਆਂ ਇਹਦੇ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਕੰਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਇਹ ਮੈਸੇਜ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਇਹ ਮਿਲਦਾ ਆ ਅਤੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਲੈਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ। ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ।
Thank you, Sadhuji, for summarizing the key messages that are from these two books. And because you spoke in Punjabi, I'll just say in a couple of sentences. The key messages that he shared with us are why it's important to keep religion out of public institutions. Why it's important to keep public education secular. Thank you, Sadhuji, for sharing your words with us. Friends, that brings us to the conclusion of the key messages and presentations. And I now would like to call upon our friend Gurpreet Singh, who is the writer of this book. He does not need further introductions because you know him dearly. So I will not, whatever I will say about him will probably not do justice. But what I would also like to, before I call him on the stage, is that I would like to acknowledge some of the support that we have received from some of our friends, because without their support we probably would not have been able to pull this program together. And as I said earlier, really want to acknowledge Dr. Pervez. She was the very first person who responded pretty much on the same day when we sent the note to her, asked her for support, and she responded very immediately. From day one, she stood with us to have this program organized. I would also like to acknowledge our other friend, Shahjad Nazir Khan. If you could please stand up for a sec. It was very helpful in terms of organizing this event, and I want to acknowledge and appreciate your support. And among all, I would also like to acknowledge the support Rachna has given us. most of you know, Rachna is Gurpreet's wife, and she played a pivotal role, who kept us on track, made sure that we attended the meetings, we were informed, and Rachna ji, without your help, we would not have been able to pull this. So I wanted to, as part of the organizers, wanted to acknowledge your support and other friends' support. Now, without further ado, I don't want to keep you waiting for much longer. I want to call, with honor, our friend Gurpreet to the podium. Please join us in welcoming. Let's hear.
First of all, I want to thank each one of you.
So really want to express my thanks to you for doing justice to the topic that you have delivered. Now, friends, I'd like to call upon one of the family members, Major Singh Sidhu, who Charlie has also acknowledged him in his note, lost his sister, nephew, and niece. When I was reading the book, Fighting Hatred with Love, I came to know a bit more about Major Singh Sidhu, about how he was affected by this tragedy, and then how he decided to enter into the Gurdwara politics to make a difference. He's now Vice President of Khalsa Diwan Society in Vancouver, and it's an honor and privilege to call upon him to have him share a few of his words. Please join me in welcoming Major Singh Sidhu.
ਮੇਰੇ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਆਪ ਆਏ ਸਾਰੇ ਮਹਿਮਾਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ, ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਮੇਰਾ ਬੋਲਣਾ ਬਹੁਤਾ ਠੀਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਅੱਜ, ਆਈ ਵੈਰੀ ਅਪਸੈਟ ਫੀਲਿੰਗ, ਪਰ ਫਿਰ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਲਈ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਬੋਲੂੰਗਾ। ਮੈਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਹੀ ਆਪ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਮਾਫੀ ਮੰਗ ਲੈਂਦਾ ਵੀ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤਾ ਮੈਂ ਬੁਲਾਰਾ ਵਧੀਆ ਨਹੀਂ, ਤਾਂ ਪਰ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨੇ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਲਿਖੀ ਆ ਫਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਹੇਟਡ ਵਿਦ ਲਵ, ਇਹਦੇ ਲਈ ਮੈਂ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਬੋਲੂੰਗਾ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਿ ਹੁਣੇ ਹੀ ਰਿਲੀਜ਼ ਕਰਕੇ ਹਟੇ ਆਪਾਂ। ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਰੇਡੀਓ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਸੀਨੀਅਰ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਨ, ਅਤੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੇਵਲ ਆਪਣੇ ਭਾਈਚਾਰੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ, ਬਾਕੀ ਦੂਸਰੀਆਂ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਉੱਚਾ ਨਾਮ ਹੈ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਵਰਗੇ ਇਨਸਾਨਾਂ 'ਤੇ ਮਾਣ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਹੈ। ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ ਮੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਦੇ ਤਾਲੁਕਾਤ ਪਰਿਵਾਰਕ ਭਰਾਵਾਂ ਵਾਲੇ ਬਣ ਗਏ ਹਨ। ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ 'ਤੇ ਬੜਾ ਮਾਣ ਆ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਕ ਸੂਝਵਾਨ ਅਤੇ ਨਿਤੜਕ ਬੰਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੋਸਤੀ ਪਾਈ ਹੈ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਆ, ਮੈਂ ਵੀ ਏਅਰ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਦੁਖਾਂਤ ਦੇ ਇੱਕ ਪੀੜਤ ਪਰਿਵਾਰ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਹਾਂ। ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਨੇ ਬੜੀ ਦਲੇਰੀ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਦਿਵਾਉਣ ਲਈ ਸੰਭਵ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ਾਂ ਕਰਦਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਅਤੇ ਕਰਦਾ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ। ਜਿੱਥੇ ਕਿਤੇ ਵੀ ਏਅਰ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਕੋਈ ਫੰਕਸ਼ਨ ਹੋਵੇ, ਇਹ ਉੱਥੇ ਹਰ ਵੇਲੇ ਪਹੁੰਚਦਾ। ਪਰ ਅੱਜ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੁੱਖ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਮੇਰੇ ਮਾਂ ਪਿਓ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਦੀ ਉਡੀਕ ਕਰਦੇ ਕਰਦੇ ਇਸ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਤੋਂ ਚਲੇ ਗਏ। ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਸਾਡਾ ਦੁੱਖ ਵਡਾਉਂਦਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਸਾਡਾ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਹੀ ਬਣ ਗਿਆ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਵੀ ਪੀੜ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ। ਪੀੜਤ ਪਰਿਵਾਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਸਹਾਰਾ ਬਣ ਕੇ ਆਇਆ ਹੈ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਉੱਪਰ ਬੜਾ ਮਾਣ ਹੈ, ਫਖਰ ਹੈ। ਅੱਜ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਮੀਡੀਏ ਅਤੇ ਜਸਟਿਸ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਵਰਗੇ ਨਤੜਕ ਇਨਸਾਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈ। ਆਰਗੇਨਾਈਜ਼ ਕ੍ਰਾਈਮ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਆਵਾਜ਼ ਉਠਾਉਣੀ ਇੱਕ ਮੌਤ ਨੂੰ ਸੱਦਾ ਦੇਣ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ। ਪਰ ਇੱਕ ਨੇਕ ਅਤੇ ਚੇਤਨ ਇਰਾਦੇ ਵਾਲੇ ਬੰਦੇ ਦੀ ਹੀ ਚੰਗਾ ਸਮਾਜ ਸਿਰਜਣ ਸਦਕੇ ਚੰਗਾ ਸਮਾਜ ਸਿਰਜਣ ਦੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਵਰਗੇ ਇਨਸਾਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਹੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਦੀ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਹਾਲੇ ਪੜ੍ਹੀ ਤਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ, ਪਰ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਪੂਰਨ ਯਕੀਨ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਤੱਥਾਂ ਉੱਪਰ ਨਿਰਭਰ ਹੋਵੇਗੀ ਅਤੇ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸੱਚਾਈ ਦੇ ਨੇੜ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾਵੇਗੀ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹੇ ਇਨਸਾਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਵੀ ਹੌਸਲੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਹੈਲਪ ਅਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮਦਦ ਕਰਨੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪੀੜਤ ਪਰਿਵਾਰਾਂ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕਰਦਾ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਰੇ ਜਣੇ ਪੜ੍ਹੋ ਅਤੇ ਦੂਸਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪੜ੍ਹਨ ਲਈ ਪ੍ਰੇਰੋ ਅਤੇ ਦੂਸਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਤੇ ਏਅਰ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਪੀੜਤ ਪਰਿਵਾਰਾਂ ਲਈ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਪਾਸੋਂ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਦੀ ਮੰਗ ਕਰੋ। ਅੰਤ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੁਰਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਕਰਦਾ ਹਾਂ। ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ।
Thank you, Major Singh ji. I know this was very emotional, but I do appreciate you taking the time to share your views with us and by being with us today. Thank you. Friends, now I'd like to call upon another member, another friend who is connected with the families. The next speaker that I would like to call upon now is our friend Adrian Dix. Many of you would know Adrian as a leader of the official opposition in this province. And many of you would have also known him through some of the other work that he has done through a number of community organizations. But today we will hear from him, about his connection, about how he and his family was impacted by the Air India tragedy. And I just wanted to say a couple of words. Adrian is married to Renee Seklikar, who lost her maternal aunt and uncle, Zebu Nisa and Uma Jetwa, who were killed in 1985 in this Air India tragedy. Renee could not be here today. I know she has attended a number of other memorial functions in the past. One of the functions that was organized by the Indo-Canadian Workers Association, she attended that, and she read a poem. I'm very pleased that, Adrian, you were able to make this event a priority. I know you had other commitments, and you were not so sure whether or not you will be able to make it here in time, but I really want to acknowledge that you have given a due respect to this event by being with us. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our another friend who represents families.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I don't pretend, because there are so many people and so many family members who can speak so eloquently for the families in the Air India case, the Air India murders that occurred, to speak for the families today. I think that my dear friend Major Singh Sidhu has done that very well. Speaking of his sister Sukhvinder Uppal and his niece and nephew who died, I do have a memory of that time, because Renee, who became my wife, was a dear friend. I remember seeing her in the days after June 23rd, 1985. And her situation and her family's situation was, as was the case of all of the families, profound and unique. Her aunt and uncle had come to this community, this city, to visit them. They were both doctors. They were setting up a clinic in India to provide care. Her Auntie Zeb was a gynecologist who I think provided extraordinary service, especially in her community, in the Muslim community, because people wanted to see her. Her care was needed and was keenly felt, and her loss was felt very deeply in her community, as was the loss of her Uncle Omar. But I do want to speak of the person that I think of at these moments, which is their son Irfan, who was at home in India, in Gujarat, when his mom and dad were killed. He was, like many of those on the plane, a child, 82 children under the age of 12 killed on the plane. And he had, of course, the opposite tragedy of having his parents killed. They were both doctors, and then they were gone. And he has grown up to be a fine, fine person under unbelievably extraordinary circumstances we could not possibly imagine. Imagine the difference in his life and what it meant to him. And we've, in my life, which has been a blessed life, I had another incident that occurred to my family. My cousin Peter, who had children, was going home for Christmas and died over Lockerbie a few years after the Air India incident. And what I can say from what I know of the families is this, because I think it's so important that Gurpreet's book talks about the families, is their bravery and their courage under very difficult circumstances, as in Lockerbie, let down by the legal system, as in Lockerbie, let down by their country, Canada. And yet, I think showing extraordinary bravery in speaking out for things that are important and that has spoken up and changed Canadian society in a positive way. So I think of them today. It's not, there are lots of us politicians here, and I'm very honored to have many members of my party here, Harry Baines and Jagrup Brar and Raj Chauhan, Raj Hundal, Amrit Mahil, Ginny Sims, and members of other parties such as Dave Hare, my friend Dave Hare, the Liberal MLA for Surrey Tynehead. This isn't our day, this is a day, and I think when we read Gurpreet's book and we read the major report, we read the voices of families who have shown us the way, which is, of course, always, surely, the way of love. So thank you, Gurpreet, for giving voice to that. Thank you for all of you for coming here today.
Once again, thank you, Adrian, for being with us today and representing voices of the families. The next friend of ours that I would like to now call upon the stage is our friend, MLA Dave Hare. Dave, as many of you will know, had lost his father, Tara Singh Hare, who was killed by fundamentalists for taking a stand. And from what I understand, he's the only journalist to have been killed in Canada. MLA Hare joined the politics to raise the voices against terrorism and against fundamentalism, and every opportunity he gets, he takes advantage to make sure that the message is not lost. Recently, when he announced his intention to leave provincial politics, one of the messages he left was that he wants to do more for victims because he believes victims have fewer rights than criminals, terrorists, and other offenders. Please join me in welcoming our friend MLA Dave Hare and hear a few words from him.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Jay, and thank you, Gurpreet, for doing this book, and thank you, Charlie, for your remarks. I agree with most of them, and Major Sidhu, thank you very much for sharing your pain that your family suffers, along with the many of the other victims who suffer the pain every day since 1985. And part of the pain my family has suffered since they shot my dad in 88 was he survived, and then 98 when he was assassinated. My mom, my sisters, brother-in-laws, nephew, nieces, and my wife and my kids, we also feel for you because we can see what it's like. And I was with Major in Ireland in 2005 when they were celebrating 20th anniversary of Air India bombing. And I know how much painful it was and how our governments came lately to recognize this. Ireland government had recognized from day one the pain and this tragedy, and they've been celebrating the lives of the victims at the same time trying to say what tragic incident this was, how terrorists were still free, who killed all these 331 innocent people, 329 in India bombing and 2 in Narita. And I also know Ujjal has often spoken about it. Sadly, there's only few politicians who speak up about it. You know, my friend Adrian Dix was just talking about it, and I tell him I have one thing in common with him. That is recognize the pain of the victims, of the innocent people, the victims of terrorism, because he feels it because of his wife. I feel it because I met with many of the family members for a long, long time, and I try to do my part as MLA. I have made many speeches over the last 11 years about Air India tragedy and the victims. And I have decided not to run again because I think I have done enough I could do provincially. I will look at some other options to see maybe we can make more difference for the victim, for society. But, you know, sadly enough, many of the politicians who were directly and indirectly involved with terrorism, some of them got acquitted because the judge said not because they were innocent, because there was not enough evidence to convict them. That's the Canadian system. It's a good system, but it's a difficult system. And when they expand the organization they run, the politicians show up there to expand them after a trial, right? It's not hidden who were the people behind them. Maybe they have lots of hand, maybe have a less hand, right? My dad knew about it. He wrote about it in 88 in his paper, which organization were involved. Exactly a week later, he was shot in 88. But that information was never translated by RCMP till in 90s. Right? That actually he had written his paper a week before he was shot in 88, where they tried to kill him, but he survived this part. So we, as all of us, must work together as a community, as a municipal government, provincial government, federal government, all the organizations, say, listen, we need laws that protect the right of the victim and society more than the criminals. Sadly, we have great charter of right, but it mostly protects criminals. When I talk to the police, when I talk to some of the judges, the lawyers, they say, you know, the charter right has come in. The rights of the victims and society has gone the other way. We need a fairness. I think that's something we all need to work on, all need to be pushing. I know our Prime Minister really believes in that. I was there with my family when Air India inquiry was started. You know, also we're waiting for the Prime Minister to make sure all the recommendation will be that were made in there will be dealt with. And I want to say thank you very much for the Prime Minister, first Prime Minister who really cares about it more than other ones, because you know, 27 years is a long time to having to deal with this. Because we had many different governments, many different prime ministers. Even when you talk about the Kamangata Maru, we have had many governments from all stripes. Nobody apologized. I think Gordon Campbell, when he was the mayor of Vancouver in 1989 or something, he put the plaque for 75th anniversary. No other mayor did it before that. I know there was an apology done about Kamangata Maru by our prime minister recently. No other prime minister did it. He's the first one to do it. And also we did a motion unanimously supported in the House about the Kamangata Maru from both sides. That was the first time done when Mike DeYoung was involved with bringing that issue there, right? So we all take blame for it. We all take responsibility for not doing enough. At the same time, we all need to have courage and stand like Gurpreet does, speak the truth. Sometimes it hurts. Kim Bolan is the other one. You know, she had death threats. They shot at her house and other parts. Gurpreet gets threats. Our family has gotten threats. Anybody else who speaks against terrorism or serious criminal gets the threats. I just wanted to thank you, Gurpreet, for standing up with the families, standing up with the society. Without you, we can't stand alone. We need to have other people say that other people care. I know many people always tell me that we care. But sadly enough, not enough the politicians care about you all the time. Sometimes they go to the victims' family funeral. Sometimes they go to the people involved in terrorism, their funeral or their function events. I have always a very clear line. If somebody is not doing something wrong, something honest, needs a good thing, needs an ordinary thing to be done, we always there. If somebody involved in criminal activity, they want to support, I will not stand up with it. My mom sent me one message when I decided to run in '99, met with Gordon Campbell. Make sure integrity of your father and your mother and your family is foremost. And I kept that in mind. I tried to do my job over the last 11 years. It will be 12 years by the time I finish in April as MLA. And I kept that in mind. My mom always said, whatever you do in the future, make sure you keep that in mind. And they say that don't be like other politicians or other people who sell their souls, right? So again, I want to thank everybody for coming over here. I want to say especially thank you to Gurpreet and your family, because without your family support, it's hard to stand up and do this, right? And your friends. And please keep up the good work. Thank you, Ojil, for standing up for so many times when your life was threatened and he didn't give up. And there are other people in here. And I know our MPs are here, and past MP Gurmant is here, and he has done his part, tried to help us there, and Jenny is there. And we always say, remember, look at the victims. Look at those old innocent people. There's nobody really caring about them. And represent their voice, not just the other side. Because if you give them fairness, we all win. We not say that you have to put 100% energy for the victims, for the society. At least give 1/3 of it for the victims and society. Maybe you can give 1/3 for the criminals, but at least give 1/3 the victims, then we will all win. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I offended anybody. I always like to speak my mind and give my thoughts as I feel them. I think it's our responsibility. But sadly, because summer games of BC are here, and I have an event to attend, I have to run by there after this. So I won't be able to stay, but I want to congratulate and thank all the speakers who are going to share their thoughts, and also the message from Prime Minister's office you're bringing on your behalf. Thank you very much. And you were also at our MP from Conservative side at Air India Memorial Service, and you made your time out of your busy schedule, and the rest of the MPs and politicians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. And also, thank you for reminding us the courage your father had and other proponents of free society. I just want to take about half a minute to also acknowledge other side of respected Tara Singh here. I just wanted to share one example about the courage and leadership that he had. This was in the late 70s. As you know, first of all, India is a very diverse country. It's represented by different languages, religions, and cultures, and Canada is also a diverse country, and it represents many Indo-Canadians who bring their different cultural and religious and linguistic backgrounds. In Vancouver, there's a smaller community who believes in one of the saints who was born from the so-called untouchable caste, and they've been pretty active for over 30 years. And in the late 70s, this group wanted to display an ad in the local media and call their spiritual guru a guru. And yet, when they went to media outlets, they were totally refused. They said, no, we're not going to publish the photo of this saint and call him guru in our publication. Guess who was the first business person, who was the first newspaper owner who took the courage? It was Tara Singh here. He came out, he says, no, I will publish the photo and I will give the proper respect that is needed because you believe in this person. And he took the risk. And I wanted to acknowledge that when we talk about taking risks, it's not one instant, it's not the isolated instant. And these are the instances which make a person a leader, a true person. And I wanted to also acknowledge the other side, because quite often these incidents never get told and they never get recorded, and I wanted to acknowledge the role he had played. Now, friends, the next our friend that we would like to invite is MP Carrie Lynn Finlay. As Dave has said, Carrie and her government has been pretty active, and he has been very sympathetic to the families of the Air India victims. And she also was one of the very few people who attended the memorial service because of the weather conditions or whatever the conditions, reasons may have been. But I wanted to share that because to me, that displays the commitment Carrie has at her personal level. She took the time to be there and be among the families. I also want to acknowledge Gurpreet Singh, who is here among us. And I know as when he was the MP, he was in the opposition, he also took this issue and Kamagadamaru issue and a number of other issues to the mainstream, and wanted to also acknowledge your presence for being here. Now, friends, I'm going to turn it over to MP Carrie Lynn Finlay, who's also the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Please give her a round of applause to MP Finlay.
Hello, everyone. These are solemn occasions, of course, but I am pleased to be here on behalf of the Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, and our government, and to recognize this occasion and to congratulate Gurpreet on his hard work and bringing his book, now published, to the attention of all of us. The bombing of Air India Flight 182, of course, it's hard to believe for anyone paying attention that it was 27 years ago. And it is a stark reminder to all of us that Canada is not immune from the threat of terrorism. And we do live with violence in our lives that is always hard to understand, and we only need to look at the news in the last little while, the incidents in Scarborough and the incidents in Colorado in the United States, and it is very, very difficult to come to terms with such acts of violence that affect us and our families. This particular act of atrocity, of course, took the lives of 280 Canadians. And as has already been said, that's the loss of a lot of opportunity, a lot of leaders of the community, and a lot of loved ones. And today bears witness once again that Canada does not forget, and we don't forget the families either. One of the first acts of our Conservative government was to commission an inquiry into the Air India bombing. The first duty, and it's a constitutional duty, of course, of any government, is to try its best to protect its citizens and to try and keep them as safe as possible. By commissioning the major report to investigate the failings, which I think we all acknowledge and we've heard about again today, that led to the attack in 1985 and some failings afterwards in investigation, that our government listened to the families of the victims when no other government would at that time. And from this report, we responded with the Air India Inquiry Action Plan. And I just want to remind you a bit about that, because the plan does respond to the major report with 6 key areas of action, including streamlining prosecution for terrorism offenses, delivering better and more effective protection for witnesses, combating the financing of terrorism, improving information sharing and interdepartmental cooperation. We've heard some of the lack of that here this morning. Improving the relationship between intelligence and evidence in criminal proceedings, and strengthening the security of the air traveling public. The action plan is a roadmap. It's a guide, a document that looks at where we were, where we are, and where we need to go. And I would like to say 27 years on that we've learned all the lessons and we've done everything that needs to be done. And of course, that isn't so. We're still implementing what this plan recommended, and we're still dealing with the tragedy. Why? Because we want to do our best to help ensure that such a horrific act does not happen again, and that we do not sit here again in the way we do now, grieving with other families and other victims. We also have recently announced the first recipients of funding under the Kanishka project, named after Air India, to fund research to better understand, prevent, and counter terrorism. We have brought in specific legislation that has responded to certain recommendations in the report, not all yet. This is all about doing what we can, of course, to prevent future terrorist acts. And it's, I think, from a government point of view, probably the most fitting memorial to try and actually make change that will prevent such tragedy in the future. This painting was referred to as beautiful, and I must say it's beautifully done. But in looking at it, the beauty that one talks about is a transcendent kind of beauty, perhaps. But it is also tragically, tragically sad. And sometimes through art, it touches the heart and we see it. We see these things in a unique way. And so I commend the artist for this work. But it certainly is something that lasts and I see used on the cover of the book, but terribly sad. We wish to thank the families of the victims who have worked and consulted on our government's action plan. We certainly commit to our continued involvement and their continued involvement with us and consulting throughout as we continue forward with implementing those recommendations. I want to say it's an honor for me to be here today. Even though, Major, I don't understand the language, I understood the emotion of your remarks, and someone who has lost several people very close to me in my own family, not through a tragedy like this, but certainly too young. I know that time means very little. The passage of time means very little when we grieve those that we love. And my heartfelt sympathies to all of those of you here today who were directly and indirectly touched by this tragedy. We'll continue to do our best. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Finlay, for sharing your sympathies, bringing your sympathies, and also sharing some of the government's action plan with us. Friends, now I'd like to call upon another friend of ours, MP Jenny Sims, MP from the Newton Delta area. Many of you would have known her. She's a very prominent face, I would say, among Canada, but probably more important, prominent among South Asian communities. I've seen her at a number of events. She and also have heard the passion that she brings about the justice, about the education, and it's probably because she was a teacher, and as a teacher, she understands the value of inclusion, and education is the primary pillar of democracy. The first time I met Jenny was during her campaign, and in the last elections, and she was a very prominent voice about the Air India tragedy, and she has also spoken out against this tragedy in the House on a number of occasions. Friends, it's my pleasure and privilege to now invite MP Jenny Sims to have her share her message with us.
I always have to start off with adjusting the mics. It's a very emotional day today, and what gives me sort of a great pleasure today is to see this room with standing room only. But also when I look across this room, we have men, women, and we have our youth here, which is really, really important. And right at the beginning, I want to say it's your presence here and all of us remembering that tragedy that gives me hope for the country we call Canada. I bring greetings today on behalf of the official opposition, the NDP, and on behalf of our leader, Thomas Mulcair, but also from the whole caucus. And I want to say today, I am honoured to be speaking for two reasons. First, I'm very proud of a very dear friend, Gurpreet Singh. He's a wonderful journalist, he's a great friend, he's a great community member, but he's also a great writer. And he has written 2 books today, the release of the 2 books today. The first one touches all our hearts, Fighting Hatred with Love. I absolutely believe that's how we've got to move forward. Healing doesn't occur because of revenge or vengeance. Healing only occurs once we accept and we move into that space called love. And it's only when you move into that space that you can experience forgiveness. And forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Sometimes people think because you've forgiven something, you've forgotten. Forgiving something, forgiving a tragedy like this for the families who went through this, is the only way for them to move forward and make their lives whole. And my dear friend Dave Hare spoke earlier. I have always had a great deal of respect for his dad, who my dad thought very highly of because of the paper and because of the kind of stance he took in his life. And when we look back to the worst act of terrorism, and we've got to call it that, the worst act of terrorism in Canadian history to Canadian citizens, when we look back at that, we always have to remember the families. I'm not going to pretend I know how Major Sidhu feels or all the other families who are here. I cannot. I can sympathize, I can empathize, but what they live day in and day out, I cannot experience at a personal level. When I looked at this picture, which I will call beautiful because it exemplifies life and death all in one. But in this picture, I see a lot of light and a lot of depth. And that light is about hope for the future. Because it's when we remember that light and we look at that hope that we can all move forward to build a better Canada, a Canada that is inclusive, where everybody is Canadian. People don't look at the color of your skin first or the language you speak before they determine whether you're a Canadian, whether you're an Indian Canadian, or whether you're a Pakistani Canadian, and others. And I always make a point of saying, I'm Canadian. I'm absolutely proud of my Indian heritage. I was born in India, grew up in England, and here I am, an MP in Canada. But I am Canadian, and I don't want another word attached to it as a qualifier. And I think that's something we all have to think about as well. We never hear of, oh, I'm a German Canadian. Oh, there goes a Swiss Canadian. There goes an English Canadian. So in the same way, we're all Canadians. And this is the country we have chosen to be our home. And this is a country where I want to pick up on the second book a little bit, Gurpreet, that I'm looking forward to reading. I grew up in a household where it was a fundamental belief that in a country where you have many religions and many cultures, there is only one way for all of us to work together. That is to defend secularism. When the voices of secularism go silent, it's not only few who will suffer. I believe our whole society suffers at that stage. Because when voices of secularism go quiet, the voices of extremism rise to the top. It was Nelson Mandela who said that those who do harm are absolutely bad, they're guilty people, right? But those who watch injustice being done are more guilty than those who are meting out the injustice. And our community, the South Asian community, has had an amazing history of social justice activism and in fighting for justice, not only for ourselves, but for everyone else as well. And I think it becomes imperative today when I look at the direction Canada is going in, that we all use those voices we have to fight for justice. I've had a very privileged life. I got to England when there were very few immigrants in England. I grew up in a school where I was the only non-white face for a while. It was very, very difficult, let me tell you. I fell asleep in my classes because they didn't have English as a second language. And I went through university. I came here and I've had a great life as a teacher, which I think is one of the noblest professions out there. And I've had no regrets about my profession. But it's only when I became an MP that I've seen a side of society that I'm going to share with you for about 30 seconds. Being an MP and being an MP in Newton, Surrey, I have seen the injustice. I have seen the unfair treatment of people. And I have people who walk into my offices, which actually feel more like the Surrey Memorial Emergency Room some days than they do an MP's office. And when I deal with those injustices, I am saddened that the community is sitting by so quiet while this is happening right now in this century, in this country. So my plea with you is absolutely secularism is the only way for us to live in a democratic country. Absolutely, we all have our religious faiths. I cherish mine, right? And we all do. But when you're dealing with a democracy, we have to deal with it in a secular way. And I'm pleading with each and every one of you to use your voices to fight for justice, not only for yourself, but those who don't have the power to use their voice. And I would say right now, our community is in need of voices that will fight for that kind of justice. Just as Mr. Hare, through his newspaper, fought for justice and took some very difficult positions, I would say today I put out a challenge to the whole community. Let's not look back 20 years from today and say we should have done something in 2012. And I want to finish off by thanking Gurpreet and thanking Punjab University for hosting this event. It's been a very sobering moment for me today, but it's also made me draw connections with what happened then and what is happening today. And I plead with you, let's work together to make sure this Canada is safe, where people of different religious faiths are respected. And if you're an atheist, you're respected just as much as if you are a religious person. Or if you don't want to let other people know your religion, that's perfectly okay as well. Let's build a Canada where there is a space for everybody, where all our children can blossom as flowers do in a flower garden. Thank you so much. Very proud.
Thank you, MP Sims. Thank you very much, MP Sims, for challenging us so that some of the injustices that we're seeing today, we will not be seeing them in another quarter of a century. And also want to appreciate sharing your thoughts with us. Now I'd like to call upon another friend of ours, Shri D.K. Sharma, Acting Consul General of India in Vancouver. Shri Sharma and Gurpreet has known now for more than 2 years. And what Gurpreet tells me that he's very pleased and impressed with the level of sympathy D.K. Sharma and his colleagues bring. Mr. Sharma is a sympathizer to families of victims. He's against terrorism, and he and his colleagues have taken strong actions to promote safer communities. Now, friends, please join me in welcoming Acting Consul General, Mr. D.K. Sharma.
Thank you, Jai. Namaskar, good afternoon, Sat Sri Akal, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. 331 lives, innocent lives, were lost on 23rd of June 1985. Even after 27 years, the perpetrators of the crime are still roaming free, whereas the families, the bereaved families, continue to grieve for their beloved ones every moment of the day. No society, no community can justify the inhuman act. No religion preaches violence, yet this premeditated act took place. While going through the book, Fighting Hatred with Love, I came across two moving experiences. One was about a child who had penned a poem after the death of his pet, and he was keen to show the poem to his grandparents in India. The child is no more with us. The grandparents, instead of sharing the happiness, the pride with the child, received the news of his death. Just see their agony. Second instance is about a father who went to India to scout for accommodation for his daughter so that she could visit India, she could visit the place of his ancestors, her ancestors, but he ended up receiving the news of her death. Now see the compassion of the child, see the agony of the father, what he would have been feeling. No words can give solace to the father or the grandparents of the child or the daughter. No one, certainly not. On behalf of the Consulate General of India, the Government of India, all my colleagues, and on my own behalf, I utilize this opportunity to pay homage to the departed souls. I pray to Almighty for giving the weapon of forgiveness to terrorize the terrorism. I pray Almighty to give that beautiful garland of love towards humanity to show that despite this cowardice act, our deep-rooted faith in creating a cosmic fabric of humanity remains unshaken. Now, talking about the author of these two books, Mr. Gurpreet Singh, I have known him for the last about 2 years. He is known to be a fearless journalist, very passionate about his work, and I do hope that he continues to serve the society in the unbiased fashion he has been doing for a long period to come. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you.
Committed by the religious extremists who wanted to instill fear in the minds of the people and break people's unity. But in the end, they failed in their mission, as not only the brave victims' families overcame their personal grief and tried to fight hatred with love, they also found allies around the world. And that is all my book about. By engaging themselves in philanthropy, these wonderful people have shamed those who are full of racial hatred and religious prejudices. Some of the people I mentioned in the book had courage to forgive the bombers. Among them are Dr. Chandrasekhar Sankurathri and Dr. A.V. Anantaraman. Both these men lost their wives and their children, and right now they are running free hospitals and schools in the South India. Likewise, Lakshmi Narayan Turlapati and his wife Padmini lost their 2 kids and are now helping poor kids. They actually try to find their own loved ones among those people. At least 2 schools in Bantry, Ireland, where the Air India families gather every year to remember their loved ones, are benefiting from the scholarship offered by these families. And I had an opportunity to visit those schools in 2010. As you know, with the bombing died many innocent dreams, as Charlie was mentioning, and they were the future of this country. Over 80 kids died in the bombing. They were all heading to India for summer vacation, without realizing that they would never return. But I salute their parents who lost their loved ones and are now helping other kids in realizing their dreams and ambitions, instead of despairing over delay in justice and mishandling of the Air India investigation. Now, my friends, before 9/11, this was the worst incident in the history of aviation terrorism. Yet the terrorism did not enter the Canadian consciousness until 9/11. The Canadian government needs to explain why its response to the June 1985 Air India bombing was so slow. Though the Sikh separatist group Babar Khalsa was blamed for the Air India disaster, can you imagine? It took Canadian government 9/11 to put a ban on them. One explanation is that the Canadian political establishment lacked will to stop anti-India activities in this country. It was maybe because at that point of time, during the Cold War era, India and Russia were in one camp, and CIA and ISI were in the opponent camp. And that was the reason why the separatist groups were given enough room to grow in North America. Now, despite such ban and tough talking against terrorism, many of our elected officials continue to give legitimacy to those who openly indulge religious bigotry. By sending army officials to the parades and events being organized by such groups, the Canadian establishment is actually sending conflicting signals. On one hand, you are fighting against terror in Afghanistan, and you are rubbing shoulders with the people who got trained in the neighboring country. It's a separate matter that the current Prime Minister, Mr. Stephen Harper, had a strong political will to order Air India inquiry. He also showed grace by apologizing to the Air India victims' families. But that is not enough, and more needs to be done to isolate extremist forces. A section of the Indo-Canadian politicians have particularly let down people like Darshan Singh, Canadian, who spent 10 years in Canada and struggled for the right to vote. Probably many of you know that Indians were disfranchised in Canada in 1907, and they got this right back in 1947. And Canadian was one of those who struggled for the right to vote. Canadian was a leftist who was killed in 1986 by the terrorists in Punjab for opposing religious fanaticism. Do not forget that these Indo-Canadian politicians made to the parliament because of the efforts of Canadian and his comrades. By rubbing shoulders with the extremist forces, these Indo-Canadian politicians have shown disrespect to people like Canadian. However, exceptions are there. Mr. Ujjal Dosanjh, Mr. Dev here have been vocal in their criticism of such divisive forces. Now, many of my friends have congratulated me for the completion of the book. Let me clarify that this book is only about the Air India victims' families, and it is not the same book I have been working on since 2005 when the Air India verdict came. My book, tentatively titled Canada's 9/11 Lessons from the Air India Bombings, is still in the pipeline. That book tries to look into the reasons behind the Air India tragedy and places the incident into the broader political context. It tries to answer some of the difficult questions as to why the politicians in India and Canada allowed the rogue element to carry out their nefarious activities, and how dangerous cocktail of religion and politics actually culminated into the Air India bombing. As Mr. Sadhu Bining was pointing out, we have to keep state and the religion apart. And how excesses by the government forces in Punjab and mishandling of some of the genuine grievances of the Punjabis, and also the 1984 anti-Sikh pogrom, actually contributed to terrorism, and that also needs to be addressed. During the course of my research, I met these families. When I got a chance to visit Ireland to cover the Air India's 25th anniversary, I met more families. After meeting people like Ananta Raman and Sanku Rathri, I began thinking about writing a separate book for these families, but I wasn't 100% sure. Eventually, I decided to write Fighting Hatred with Love, and I'm thankful to Mr. Satish Gulati for taking interest in my book. Now, this book is not a one-man show. It's a teamwork. I want to thank Patricia Anderson and Kimball Carew for editing my book. I'm also thankful to Sheetal Anmol, a prominent painter who made the cover illustration. He also made a painting depicting the goriness of this crime against humanity. I also want to thank my son Kautik Singh, who took my profile picture. And I'm also thankful to my wife Rashna, who stood behind me like a true comrade in the face of threats and intimidations. And last but not least, I'm thankful to my employer, Mr. Maninder Singh Gill, the Radio India Managing Director, for giving me freedom to speak fearlessly on Air India on the radio and sponsoring my visit to Ireland. Unfortunately, he is not here. I'm also thankful to Mr. Gurmant Garewal, the former Member of Parliament, for helping me in getting all the volumes of the Air India inquiry report. Mr. Garewal was one of a few politicians who continued to press the government in ordering the Air India inquiry. Charlie Smith, whom I always considered my mentor, gave me enough space to write about Air India in his paper, and that material is also a part of this book. Now I'd like to recognize those who have both explicitly and moderately opposed extremism within our community. Among them are the Indo-Canadian Workers Association leaders and activists Surinder Sangha, Surinder Tesi, Kulwant Tesi, and Hardev Singh Sunar and Harkeval Taliwal, who were formerly associated with the group. Some other prominent names are the former Surrey Sikh Temple President Balwant Singh Gill, the former Vancouver Sikh Temple President Kashmir Singh Taliwal, and the former Prince George Sikh Temple leader Preet Sandhu. Prominent Sikh scholars like Gurnam Singh Sanghera and Gyani Harkir Singh also faced many threats and intimidations. The authors like late Darshan Gill, Mahinder Sumal, and Gurcharan Rampuri also faced challenges for speaking up against fundamentalism. Sadhu Winning also did his part. The media persons like Rupinder Hare Bance of Indo-Canadian Times, whose father and the founding editor of the paper died as a critic of extremism, Sarwan Singh Randhawa, former editor of Sach Di Awaz, and Sushma Dutt of Rim Jim Radio also played their part. Those who have kept the Air India issue alive are Mr. Suresh Kurl, a member of the National Payroll Board, who used to write for The Link. I think he's in the crowd. I would request him to please stand up and be recognized. He is one of a few voices for the Air India victims' families. And he consistently wrote to the press to press the government for ordering a full inquiry. Vinay Sharma, who has consistently organized Air India Memorial Service at the Surrey's Hindu Temple, and authors like Nadeem Parmar, Amrit Diwana, Harchand Bagri, Mohan Gill, and some others also wrote about Air India. Others who also played a significant role in promoting secularism in our community are groups like Sansad, whose former leader, Mr. Harinder Mal, is here, who happens to be the former chairperson of the BC Human Rights Commission, and also the activists and friends from community of progressive Pakistani Canadians, and also the Chetna group. In the end, I want to thank my media colleagues who gave coverage to my book and helped in spreading message for the event. They are Kim Bolan with Vancouver Sun, Fabian Dawson with The Province, Ajit Jain with India Abroad, Meera Bains with CBC, Imtiaz Phopat with Co-op Radio, Umendra Singh, the editor of Asian Star, Gurvinder Singh Taliwal with Awaze Punjab, Harjinder Thind and Rishi Nagar with Radio Red FM, Harpreet Singh with Joy TV, Gurdeep Singh Garewal with Hamdard, Kulwinder Aujla of Indo-Canadian Times, and my colleague Devinder Benipal with Radio India, and all other media outlets and colleagues. And of course, Charlie Smith, the great editor of Georgia State. And I also want to thank Sunil Narula with Indo-Canadian Voice and Kamaljeet Thind with the Mac Punjabdi for being here. And thank you very much once again for coming out and joining us. And particularly, I would want to thank Samar Parvez, the future head of the English faculty, and Jay Bidri for organizing this event. Thank you very much.